The final note: how a broken dog and a silent girl changed each other's fate. The concert hall was silent. Not out of respect, not yet, but because the girl on stage hadn't spoken a word in 5 years, and the German Shepherd curled at her feet had once lunged at every human who got too close. This was the moment they'd been building toward, but no one saw it coming. Lyra didn't introduce herself. She sat at the piano. Echo didn't perform a trick. He closed his eyes, rested his head on her foot, and exhaled. And then it began the quietest performance the town had ever heard. This story starts years before that night, with a girl lost in grief, a dog discarded by the system, and a sanctuary built on one belief: trust begins in the quiet. Stay with this story. Let it unfold. It's not the ending that will move you. It's the silence just before it. The hallway smelled like bleach and cold metal. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, casting harsh reflections on the sterile floors. Behind a reinforced glass wall, a German Shepherd stood alone, his breath fogging the glass with every exhale. His name, if one still dared to call it, that was Echo. Scarred across the muzzle, one ear notched from an old tear, Echo didn't look like a typical K9 unit anymore. There was something fractured in his gaze, somewhere between a soldier and a shadow. He paced in silence, step measured, step taut, as if waiting for something he couldn't name. Inside the observation room, 3 men watched him through a narrow panel. "He's late again," murmured Captain Hurst, glancing at his watch. He was stocky, older, with a habit of biting his lower lip when nervous. "He knows what this is," replied Commander Ellis, arms folded tightly across his chest. "Hell, the whole base knows what today is." They turned as the door opened. Lieutenant Brax entered, tall, stiff-backed, clutching a manila folder to his chest like it might explode. "Let's get this over with," Ellis said. Outside, in the center of the concrete training yard, a handler waited young, cocky, wearing a padded sleeve and too much bravado. He whistled sharply. The door of the kennel slid open with a mechanical groan, and Echo stepped out like a ghost emerging from a long-forgotten trench. The yard went still. Echo's movements were silent, smooth, too smooth. Not a bark, not a growl, just that dead-set stare, fixed on the man with the sleeve. "Command, engage," the trainer barked. No response. The man tried again, louder this time, adding hand signals. Echo didn't move. A full 10 seconds passed. Then, without warning, Echo launched not toward the arm, not toward the target, but straight at the man's throat. "Chaos." The trainer screamed, barely lifting the sleeve before Echo's teeth sank deep into it. He was thrown off his feet, dragged to the ground, the padded sleeve torn from his arm. Echo didn't stop. He kept going, straight for the center mass, snarling feral, not tactical. It took 2 men and a tranquilizer to pull him off. When they finally got him back behind the reinforced glass, Echo didn't pant. He didn't pace. He just stood there, blood on his teeth, eyes flat and unreadable. He didn't look at anyone. He looked through them. The debriefing room fell into a heavier silence than before. Lieutenant Brax opened the folder and handed over the latest report. Ellis scanned it quickly, then dropped it on the table like it stung. Failed obedience reconditioning. Fails to respond to food, voice, touch, or rank-based cues. Increased hypervigilance. Redirects aggression toward non-targets. Lunged at non-hostile unit. Final line. Untrainable. Consider disposal. Hurst looked away. "We tried," Brax said softly. 6 months of rehabilitation protocols, different handlers, sensory reset training, bonding therapy, even music. "Music?" Ellis scoffed. "There's precedent," Brax replied. "Auditory healing has been effective with PTSD-struck canines. But with Echo," he trailed off. "He's broken," Hurst muttered. "Worse," Ellis said. "He remembers." Outside the window, Echo sat now, calm again. But it wasn't peace. It was withdrawal. The kind soldiers wear in their eyes after seeing too much and coming home to nothing. Ellis turned his back to the glass. "We'll schedule a board review." "You mean?" "Yes. End of service." Hurst stood and walked to the door. "What happened to him?" he asked, more to the room than anyone. No one answered. The file was closed. The lights in the room flicked to red as a security alert was triggered for Echo's cell. They would no longer open his door without sedation. As the men filed out, one by one, Echo remained seated, unmoving. Only his ears twitched slightly as the door clicked shut behind them. And then, somewhere down the corridor, faint and slow, a sound rose. A melody, soft, delicate. A child's voice humming, not clear, not close, but just enough to make Echo's ears rise, just enough to pause the stillness. His head tilted, briefly. Then he lowered it again, eyes half closed. Still breathing, still listening, still alive. The concrete didn't echo in this part of the facility. It swallowed sound like it had swallowed names, voices, and whatever scraps of gentleness the dogs that lived here once had. Echo lay curled in the farthest corner of Kennel B-17. Shadow draped over him like a shroud. His ribs rose and fell with a cautious rhythm, always one ear lifted. The rest of the facility hummed with routine. Boots on the floor, metal on metal. Short commands barked to younger dogs in training. But in this quadrant, the air was different. Dense, watchful. His eyes, amber and dulled at the edges, flicked toward movement before it even arrived. A feeder passed, wheeling a cart that rattled with dry kibble and water buckets. She didn't look in. None of them did anymore. When she slid the tray through the slot, Echo didn't move. Not right away. He waited until she was 3 steps gone, then padded forward with a limp too subtle for most to catch. His left hind leg stiff from old tendon damage clicked faintly as he walked. The tray was full, untouched, but he didn't eat. He sniffed the water, then returned to the corner, nose just barely touching the floor, eyes wide open. The tag on the front of his kennel had once borne his name. Echo. Bold, black letters on military-grade laminate. Now someone had scrawled, "Caution, aggressive," over it in red marker. The old letters bled through like a memory refusing to be erased. Outside his cage, they called him a ghost, some joked. Others said it like a warning. Ghost in the cage. You get too close, he'll disappear into your throat. But Echo didn't bark. He didn't snap without reason. He growled low and guttural when someone lingered too long, or made eye contact, or moved too quickly. But he didn't strike unless provoked. They didn't understand that most of what Echo did was not out of violence, but out of memory. The first time they used the collar, he was barely a year old. A voice had called his name sweet at first, gentle, then firm, then louder. He hadn't sat fast enough. The jolt that hit him didn't come with warning, just a searing whip down his spine and the smell of his own urine on the floor. Someone laughed, said, "He'll learn." He did, but not the way they wanted. Echo learned that silence kept you alive. That quick obedience wasn't about loyalty, was survival. That sometimes doing everything right still earned you pain. He remembered the war zone drills, rubber gunfire, blasting horns, running through clouds of tear gas while trainers shouted numbers instead of names. He remembered lunging at dummies until his teeth ached. Remembered real bodies too. One hadn't moved after he bit. The man had been in civilian clothing. Echo had only seen the trainer nod once before the signal came. That night, they gave him extra meat and called him Good Boy. He didn't sleep for 3 days. Now, in this cage, no voices came. Only steel and clanking locks and the occasional shuffling of a new recruit who didn't know better. One such recruit had paused outside his kennel last week. Young, overconfident, knees bent just enough to appear unafraid. Echo had not growled at first. He watched. Then the recruit tapped the gate with a boot. A taunt. Echo was at the bars in less than half a second. Silent, swift, jaws stopping inches from the metal. No bark, no warning. The kid screamed. Echo didn't flinch. He held eye contact for 5 long seconds before backing away, retreating to the shadows like a wolf returning to his den. The next morning, Echo's tray had less food. Just a note taped to the gate. Hostile, dangerous, reevaluation unnecessary. Some nights, when the building hushed and only distant humming lights remained, Echo would lift his head. His ears twitched toward the wind, outside barely audible through thick walls. Something in the breeze leaves brushing, a siren far off, or the hollow rattle of chain-link fences would stir something old in him. Not a memory, not exactly. More like a feeling that had no words. Something like longing. But when morning came, the armor returned. No one spoke his name anymore. No one said Echo. Just that one or the lost cause, a ghost in the records. In the administrative wing, a thick folder sat untouched for weeks. Echo, K9, 741A. Paper-clipped notes with dates, strikes, and one final recommendation scrawled in capital letters. Untrainable. Consider disposal. They didn't specify how or when, just that he'd run out of chances. Back in the kennel, Echo stirred as a light flickered overhead. He stood, circled twice, and lay down again, but this time, his chin rested gently on his paws, eyes open, staring at nothing. If you stood quietly at the far end of the hallway, you'd hear nothing, not breathing, not movement, only the silence of something still alive, but already forgotten. The facility smelled of bleach and despair. Concrete floors stretched long beneath flickering fluorescent lights, casting sterile shadows that clung to the walls like ghosts no one dared name. The air was heavy with the scent of cold metal, and anxious fur sounds of distant barking echoed intermittently, as though the walls themselves were trying to forget. Lyra's shoes made soft squeaks as she walked beside her uncle, Daniel Raines. He had once worked with her mother, both of them decorated K9 handlers in the Federal Tactical Division. Her mother was gone now. 3 months. The kind of gone that echoed louder in quiet places like this. Lyra hadn't said much since the funeral, and Daniel, to his credit, hadn't tried to fill the silence with false comfort. "You don't have to come back here, kid," he said gently, holding a clipboard in one hand, eyes scanning a file with furrowed brows. "I wanted to," she replied. It was the first thing she'd said in 20 minutes. They passed rows of kennelsome dogs, paced restlessly. Others sat rigid, eyes sharp and trained. One barked, low and warning. Another whimpered when they walked by. But one cage remained still, heavy with something colder than aggression. Absence. Daniel slowed as they approached it. "Echo," he muttered under his breath, almost like a warning. Inside, the German shepherd stood like stone, not pacing, not resting, just there. His coat was a collage of scars and hardened muscle, fur patchy in places where old wounds never quite healed. His eyes were not dull, but not wild either. They were awake, watchful, old, in a way that hurt to meet. Lyra stopped. She didn't say a word. Instead, she moved away from Daniel's side, stepping slowly toward the kennel. She didn't flinch when the motion caused Echo's ears to tilt forward, or when his shoulders tensed, almost imperceptibly. She crouched, then sat cross-legged on the cold floor across from him. The cage door between them was solid steel mesh, reinforced, with a rusting lock and faded red warning sticker. Caution, aggressive, do not approach alone. Daniel opened his mouth as if to stop her, but stopped himself. There was something in the girl's stillness, in the quiet gravity she carried, that didn't feel reckless. Lyra just sat, hands in her lap, no phone, no words, no sudden moves. Echo stared. His ears twitched at the hum of a light above. His body remained taut, breath shallow, eyes pinned to the girl's face like trying to decode a language he'd long forgotten. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. She still hadn't spoken. Daniel shuffled papers behind them, uncomfortable. "He's been marked for disposal," he muttered. "They're not saying it out loud, but... well, you saw the file. Untrainable. Irreparably aggressive. Unresponsive to stimuli. They tried everything." Lyra's gaze never left Echo's. "Maybe that's the problem," she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel. And for the first time since the last handler had screamed in pain, Echo didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't bare his teeth. He blinked. Once. A gust of wind outside rattled a window somewhere down the hall. The silence inside the kennel grew deeper, heavier, almost sacred. In Lyra's chest, something Shiftetta weight she hadn't known how to carry began to take shape. She didn't see a monster. She didn't see a failed weapon. She saw eyes like hers, haunted. searching. She leaned forward just an inch and whispered, "Hi." It was nothing a breath, really. But Echo's ears lifted again, not with threat, but with something like curiosity. His muscles remained tight, but the tension was no longer bracing for violence. It was waiting. Lyra smiled. It was small, tentative, like trying a forgotten song note for the first time in years. Daniel, arms crossed, watched with the wary confusion of a man who'd seen too many miracles turn out to be tricks. "He's not safe," he said finally. "Lyra, I know you're hurting, but this isn't therapy. That dog is dangerous." She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she took something from her backpack, a small, leather-bound notebook with a broken elastic stray band, slid it across the floor until it rested just outside the cage. Echo looked down at it, sniffed the air once, then looked back at her. "She used to write notes to the dog she trained," Lyra said, her voice like the edge of rain. "Said they understood more than people gave them credit for. Said words left outside a cage can find their way in." Echo didn't move, but his breathing slowed. The hallway lights flickered again, briefly casting both of their shadows sewn small and still. One crouched and coiled into a fleeting silhouette on the far wall. Two souls, quietly watching each other across metal and memory. And in that moment, no one moved. But something changed. The walls of the Hale household used to breathe music, but now, silence pooled in the corners like dust. It hung over everything, over picture frames, tilted slightly on their hooks, over the dining table that hadn't been fully set in months, over the couch where Lyra used to curl up beside her mother, whispering harmonies while Meredith gently adjusted her fingers on the guitar frets. Since the funeral, Lyra hadn't spoken a word. She hadn't cried either. She just stopped. Her voice, once soft and bright like spring water over stones, had faded the moment the paramedics zipped Meredith Hale's body into a black bag. "Heart failure," they said. Sudden, unfair, final. And with it, a part of Lyra had curled up and gone to sleep. Now, at 7 years old, Lyra spent most of her afternoons on the window seat in the living room, legs folded beneath her, her mother's old guitar laid across her lap like a sleeping animal. Her fingers moved gently over the strings, not to play any particular song, but to feel the vibration, to remember the way Meredith's voice used to blend with the notes, like honey poured into morning tea. The guitar was the last thing they'd shared. The last lesson had been on a rainy Tuesday. Meredith, dressed in a threadbare hoodie and faded jeans, had sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing every time Lyra hit the wrong chord. "It's okay," she'd said, brushing a curl behind her daughter's ear. "The heart finds its way into the music long before the hands do." Lyra didn't know how to carry that heart now. She only knew how to remember. Her father, Nathan Hale, moved like a ghost through the house. Grief had stripped him of language too, though in a different way. He still spoke muttered things about errands, the news, the weather, but never to Lyra. Never really with her, just around her, like one navigates fragile furniture in the dark. He had loved Meredith in that quiet, unshakable way some men do, deep as bedrock and just as silent. When she died, he didn't collapse. He calcified. Some nights, Lyra would hear the creak of his chair in the study and the low hum of the whiskey bottle being uncorked. Once, she saw him hold Meredith's old scarf in both hands, pressing it to his face with eyes closed. But when he emerged into the hallway moments later and saw Lyra watching, he simply turned and walked away. He didn't know how to grieve out loud, and she didn't know how to grieve in words. So the silence stretched between them like a frozen lake, both afraid to be the one to break the surface. At school, Lyra had stopped raising her hand. Teachers tried coaxing her with candy, patience, even music. But she remained withdrawn, a quiet figure in the back of the classroom, sketching dogs with haunted eyes. One therapist said it was trauma-induced mutism. Another said it was a coping mechanism. No one said the obvious, that she was simply waiting. For what, no one knew. Until that day at the detention kennel when she saw him. But she hadn't told her father about that yet, not in words. She hadn't needed to. That night, after visiting the facility with Uncle Ray, Lyra sat by the fireplace with the guitar cradled against her chest like a shield. She didn't strum, she just held it, her thumb brushing the worn wood at the bridge, Her father passed behind her on the way to the kitchen, glanced once at her, then paused. "Was it a good day?" he asked. His voice was rough, uncertain, like he was trying to remember how to speak to her. Lyra didn't nod. She didn't look up, but her fingers moved just barely across a single string. A low, aching note filled the room. Faint, imperfect. Nathan stood there for a moment, as if listening to a language he had once known but forgotten. Then he walked on, and the silence returned. But Lyra kept her eyes on the embers, and in the dim glow of that half-dead fire, she remembered the pair of eyes behind the cage, yellow-brown, tired, and watching. Not hostile, not hopeful, just waiting, the same way she was. The morning was still wrapped in a silvery mist when Lyra returned to the facility. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, metal, and rain-soaked earth. Her footsteps echoed against the concrete walkway, too soft to command attention, too persistent to be ignored. Cradled in her arms was a worn guitar case, its surface scratched, the handle wrapped in fading black taffeta, kind of wear that told a story without needing words. One of the kennel techs spotted her at the gate. "You can't bring that in," he muttered, his brows furrowing beneath the bill of his cap. "This is a containment facility, not a campfire circle." Lyra didn't flinch. She simply stood there, eyes calm, letting the silence speak. The tech radioed up to the director. It didn't take long before Director Halverson himself appeared, clipboard in hand, the lines around his mouth etched deeper than the last time she'd seen him. He looked at the guitar case, then at Lyra, a girl barely 17, pale and steady and far too quiet for someone her age. "She's wasting her time," he said over his shoulder to no one in particular. "But she's Meredith's daughter." He waved her in. As the gates buzzed open, Lyra gave a soft nod. She didn't thank him aloud, didn't need to. Some silences carried more weight than words. The kennels stretched along the west wing like hollow, breathing vaults. Metal bars lined each pen, most occupied by the bruised and broken remnants of Wara patchwork of forgotten heroes. But one cage, set furthest from the others, was different. No name, no label, just thick gauge bars, double locks, and a warning sign in red block letters. Caution, extreme aggression. Inside, Echo sat coiled like smoke, still as a statue, but his eyes followed everything. He watched Lyra approach, head low, shoulders relaxed, steps deliberately unthreatening. She stopped just beyond the gate, not quite within reach, but close enough that the scent of pine soap from her jacket drifted through the bars. Without a word, Lyra lowered the guitar case and unlatched it. Echo tensed. His ears didn't flatten, but his pupils narrowed like twin pinpricks. He didn't growl yet. With careful hands, she lifted the guitar out, the soft creak of wood and string brushing the air like breath. The body was aged mahogany, the strings slightly oxidized but tuned. Her mother's guitar, the last thing they'd shared before everything went silent. Lyra sat cross-legged, her back straight, head slightly tilted. She didn't look at Echo directly. She didn't need to. Her fingers moved over the strings with an instinct born of memory. The first notes of Scarborough Fair drifted into the sterile airsoft, deliberate, like raindrops on an old porch. "Are you going to Scarborough Fair?" Her voice never came, but the melody did. Echo didn't blink, his ears angled forward. The growl that usually crept up his throat when humans came close stayed buried. The song's rhythm was neither sad nor hopeful. It simply existed, a ghost of something once shared between mother and daughter. A melody that remembered how to breathe even when grief had taken all the air away. Lyra didn't look up, not once. Her fingers continued, each chord familiar, each note steady. The music wasn't for show. It wasn't a plea or a performance. It was a presence. It filled the void between them with something warmer than tolerance, gentler than demand. On the other side of the bars, Echo shifted, not away, forward, just an inch. Just enough that the light caught the faint, ragged scar over his left shoulder. It twitched as he moved, proof of pain, of something done to him that never healed clean. The trainers watched from a distance, murmuring. One of them scoffed. "It's a fluke. He's just not used to hearing anything soft." She'll get herself bit," another whispered. "He's baited calm before." But Halverson said nothing. He stood further back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed not in disdain, but in something quieter. Memory, maybe. The song ended not with a flourish, but a sigh of fingers against string. Lyra didn't look up. She simply laid her hand across the guitar's body, stilling it, letting silence fall again, this time not empty, but full. Echo didn't lunge, didn't snarl. He stared at her with an expression that wasn't trust, but wasn't threat either. Something liminal. A question, perhaps. She met his gaze then, briefly, not long enough to challenge him, just long enough to say, "I see you." He didn't look away. For the first time since being confined in that cage, Echo didn't respond to human presence with fear or fury. He responded with stillness. And stillness, for a dog like Echo, was the beginning of change. Lyra rose slowly, lifted the guitar, and walked away. No fanfare, no smile. But the next day, she came back. And Echo was already waiting, not wagging, not soft, but awake in a way that felt less like a trigger and more like recognition. The days blurred gently into one another, the way grief often bends time. Morning light no longer came as a jolt, but a quiet knocking at Lyra's window, and with it, a choice she no longer had to think twice about. She packed her guitar, brushed her hair into a loose braid like her mother once did, and walked the familiar path to the detention kennel where Echo waited behind steel in silence. No one understood why she kept coming. The trainers had stopped asking. A few had made offhand remarks about wasted effort, about the futility of trying to reach a dog that was already lost in the head. But Lyra didn't answer, not with words. She hadn't in over 9 months. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the concrete just beyond the reinforced gate of Echo's pen. No guards now, no clipboard-bearing officials, just her and the dog who had once lunged at a man with such precision it had left tendons exposed. Echo didn't growl anymore. At first, he kept his distance, body taut, eyes sharp like broken glass. But something had changed. Maybe it was the way Lyra moved, never sudden, never demanding. Or maybe it was her silence, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from knowing. She would strum once, then again, gentle, imperfect notes. Sometimes it was Scarborough Fair, sometimes only humming. Sometimes her fingers would stop altogether, resting in her lap, and they would just sit there, girl and dog, divided by steel, but tethered by something neither one of them could name. One day, it rained. Cold needles of water tapped against the kennel roof, and Lyra arrived anyway, guitar slung across her back, hood soaked. She took her seat, hands trembling slightly from the chill. The guards gave her one look through the viewing glass, but said nothing. She opened the case, the velvet inside spotted with drops, and played a single note. Echo didn't move. She played again, her thumb brushing softly across the strings like someone coaxing breath from stone. The music filled the narrow hallway, wove around the bars, through the scent of wet fur and rusted metal, until it reached the dog. Echo stood. He didn't approach, not yet, but he didn't retreat either. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. His ears, once permanently pinned in aggression, flicked toward the sound. A twitch, a shift, a thread being pulled. That afternoon, Lyra didn't play long. The rain picked up, and her hands grew stiff. She packed the guitar and sat with her legs pulled to her chest, and for the first time, Echo lay down. The next day, the sun returned. A shaft of light spilled through the viewing corridor, catching dust motes in midair like drifting memories. When Lyra arrived, she noticed something different. Echo was already at the front of his cage, waiting. No growl, no step back. She slowly sat down, unsure if it was a trick of routine. He didn't flinch. For a long while, she didn't play. She just sat, her hand resting on her guitar case, eyes watching him as he watched her. Then, instinctively without thought, she stretched her hand forward, not into the cage, not even through the bars, just close enough. Echo looked down at it. A long breath passed between them. Something fragile hung in the space, something a whisper could break. He didn't move away. She didn't touch him, wouldn't, but her hand remained steady, palm up, fingers relaxed, not asking, only offering. And that was the difference. Echo exhaled low, not a growl, but a sound like memory uncoiling. Then He lay back down, his body angled, not away from her, but toward, close enough that if the gate wasn't there, her fingertips would have brushed his fur. That night, Lyra didn't sleep much. She thought of her mother Meredith Halehouse. She once said, "Trust doesn't begin with words. It begins in the quiet." She had meant it about the dogs, of course, but Lyra had only come to understand it now. In the silence between strums, in the stillness of an outstretched hand, in the way Echo's eyes, once hollow, now watched her, not with threat, but with memory. Each day after that, they met again. Lyra came, sat, played, or didn't. Echo waited. He no longer stood rigid. Sometimes, when the song began, he would close his eyes not asleep, but listening. Her music became the language they both shared, not one of command, but companionship. The handlers began whispering. "That girl," they said. "Something's happening." The director watched on the monitors but didn't interrupt. Lyra didn't need approval. She didn't need results. She only needed the one thing no one else had offered him: presence. It was a week to the day since the rain when it finally happened. Lyra placed her hand once more near the gate, closer this time. She kept playing with the other hand, soft rhythm, like breath. Echo stood, took a step forward, then another, and then his nose, scarred and rough, touched the ground within inches of her fingers. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. They stayed that way until the song ended. Two silent beings, bound not by force, but by understanding. The handlers would later call it a breakthrough. Lyra never said a word. She didn't have to. It began the way nightmares often downeth silence. But this was not the gentle hush of sleep. It was a vacuum, a cold, electric stillness. Echo's breath was shallow, twitching. His body trembled beneath a thin layer of straw, claws twitching against concrete. In his dream, he was younger, leaner. His fur had not yet gone dull from confinement or loss, but there was already something broken in his eyes, something that knew fear in its rawest, most systematic form. The pole was always there, rusted, buried deep into a cement slab, surrounded by chain-link fences and the indifferent sky of an undisclosed desert base. Echo was leashed tightly to it no escape. A collar buzzed softly around his throat, humming like a warning. The man in the fatigues never spoke softly. His voice was sharp, clipped, and without patience. "Sit." Now, Echo had hesitated. Maybe because a hummingbird had darted past the fence. Maybe because the sand burned his paws. Or maybe, in that fleeting second, something inside him resisted. A flicker of instinct that dared to ask, "Why?" The shock came instantly. His limbs seized. A small yelp escaped, unpermitted. The man didn't blink, didn't move. Again, the drills went on for hours, days, weeks. He learned quickly, do not think, only react. Do not feel, only follow. Pain was the language, obedience the prize. But even as he learned, something inside Echo grew calloused, hardened, not stronger, but colder. By the end of that summer, the only thing that made sense to him was commands barked under pressure, the bite of current, and the sharp tang of blood in his mouth from biting too hard on nothing. That was how they built him, or tried to. But some spirits, even when cornered, refuse to die. They fracture, they disappear inward, and they wait. The present returned like a flood, abrupt and breathless. Echo's eyes shot open. His whole body jerked against the concrete floor of his kennel. His breathing was ragged, ears twitching, tail rigid against the ground. A low growl rose from his chest, warning shadows that no longer existed. The chain-link door clattered slightly in the wind. A ray of sun slid across the floor like a slow-moving ghost. And then, he heard it. Softly, like the memory of something kind, came the guitar. The notes were hesitant at first, as if the hands that played them were unsure of the welcome. But they grew steadier, weaving through the stale air with a grace no one in this place had ever bothered to show him. Lyra sat cross-legged just beyond the gate. Her hoodie was dusted with straw, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. The guitar, small and worn, rested against her chest like it had always belonged there. She didn't speak. She never did. But her eyes met his with something Echo could not decode, something between patience and sadness. She had seen him like this before. Seen the tremors after a nightmare, the wild dart of his gaze when he wasn't fully awake, the way he sometimes paced for hours like a prisoner counting invisible steps. She didn't flinch when he growled, not anymore. She just played. Today, it was slower. Not a song with words, but something closer to breath. Echo didn't know music, but his instincts, the ones no training had ever touched, told him this sound wasn't trying to command. It was offering. He shifted slowly, stiff limbs responding like old hinges. He didn't stand, just adjusted, pressing his side against the cooler part of the floor. His breathing began to slow. He watched her. Her fingers moved like water calloused. Sure, but gentle. Eyes down. She was somewhere else when she played. Somewhere far from kennels and fences and the kind of pasts that made you wake up growling. Something in her posture said, "I won't come closer, but I'm not going away." And Echo, against every lesson burned into his nerves, didn't retreat. He laid his head on his paws and let the music happen. No one had ever given him space like this. No one had ever sat without needing something from him. Not a bark, not an attack, not submission, just presence. And in that strange, hushed moment, just the scraping of strings and the soft exhale of breath, something passed between them. A memory flickered, not one of war or pain, but something older, a hand, small, reaching out, not to command, not to discipline, just to touch. It was gone before it took form, but it left behind a quiet ache. He didn't understand it. But for the first time in longer than memory could stretch, he didn't fear it. Outside the kennel, someone watched. The director stood with arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Still no vocal response from the girl?" a junior trainer asked. "None," the man replied. But Echoes stopped growling. The trainer frowned. "You think it means something?" The director didn't answer at first. He just kept watching. "She's not training him," he murmured. "She's listening to him." And perhaps, in a place where orders had failed, where pain had built monsters instead of soldiers, that was the beginning of something new. Not a command, but a conversation. Unspoken, unhurried, alive. Morning came gray, with a soft drizzle whispering across the rooftops of the rehabilitation facility. The metal of the kennels let out quiet groans as it expanded under the chill, and the corridor smelled faintly of damp hay and rust. Echo had been awake long before dawn. His body still bore the tension of dreams. Not dreams. Really memories that had slipped beneath his fur and settled deep in his marrow. He'd stood for hours after the last flash of light behind his eyelids, unmoving, his breath slow and watchful. Then he'd heard it. Not a command. Not boots. Not the harsh scrape of keys or the click of taser triggers. It was humming. Soft. Human. Slightly off key. And yet steady. He turned toward the hallway without snarling. That alone was enough to make the young staffer, Max, drop his clipboard when he passed by. The other dogs stirred in their pens, some barking, some pacing, but Echo remained still, ears tilted, tracking the approach of that sound. At the far end of the corridor, Lyra appeared. She wore the same navy coat she always did, the sleeves too long for her arms. Her guitar was strapped across her back, its case patched with old stickers and one peeling name tag in faded ink, M. Hale. She didn't speak. She never did, not since the accident. But the hum was hers. She walked as if the world around her didn't require explanation, just quiet presence, just music. Echo stepped forward before his mind could stop him. 3 paces. Enough for his paw to cross the shadowed line he never used to breach. Enough for Max to mutter, "Holy hell," under his breath from behind the observation glass. Lyra didn't react. She knelt, unhooked the case, and opened it slowly, like someone unwrapping a letter from the past. Her fingers were pale but sure, and she plucked the strings once before, adjusting a tuning knob. Then, without ceremony, she began. No dramatic chord, no singing. Just the gentle weaving of a melody she'd played for days, now notes that had folded themselves into Echo's world like the scent of old pine. It was Scarborough Fair, again, but slower. As if she was holding each note a moment longer, giving it time to settle, to ask permission. Echo didn't growl. He didn't retreat into the corner like he did for every uniformed man who approached. He didn't pace, didn't bare teeth. Instead, he lowered himself, belly to floor, legs tucked. His tail thudded once, a hesitant, nearly imperceptible wag. From the surveillance room, the director leaned forward in his chair, one hand still gripping his coffee like he'd forgotten it was there. Lyra kept playing. Between verses, her eyes found echoes. She never looked at him like the others, did never like a threat or a problem or a thing to be fixed. She looked like someone who had known loneliness, who had sat inside it and played music just to survive the silence. And Echo, scarred and silent, understood that kind of gaze. He rose slowly and padded toward the gate. Max's voice, a faint whisper through the comms, cracked. "He's coming up, he's actually." But no alarms went off. No one moved. The only sound was the hush of rain beyond the roof and the fragile harmony of Lyra's guitar. Echo reached the gate and sat. Then after a pause that felt like breath held across species, he eased down again, chin lowering until it touched the cold concrete just inches from the bars. Lyra stopped playing. The silence was deliberate, like the end of a prayer. She didn't reach out yet. Instead, she placed the guitar down beside her, leaned forward on her knees, and extended one hand toward the cage. Palm up. Still. Echo sniffed once, twice. Then, with a kind of ancient slowness, he leaned closer. His scarred muzzle hovered over her fingers. His breath was warm, earthy like wild places and gunpowder and forgotten grief. For one long moment he hesitated, as if some ghost in his muscle memory warned him, "Don't trust, don't reach, don't." But the ghost had lost its grip. Echo closed the space, his muzzle pressed against her palm. Lyra didn't flinch. She just blinked, once, and let her fingers rise slightly to graze the side of his face where the fur was uneven, where the old burns had taken root. "Did that just happen?" Max asked, breathless. The director didn't answer. His eyes were on the camera feed, where the girl and the so-called untrainable dog sat across from each other. No commands, no treats, no force. Just contact. Echo didn't pull away. If anything, his body softened, shoulders uncoiled, ears dipped slightly. The kind of posture no one had seen from him in months. Years, perhaps. Lyra sat there for a long time. The hand remained where it was, still cradling his trust. She didn't smile, didn't cry. Just watched him, as though witnessing something sacred rise from the ashes of something broken. And when she finally pulled her hand back, slow as dusk, Echo didn't move. He just lay there, in the hush she left behind, as if her presence had stitched warmth back into the hollow corners of his cage. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, clouds, thickening like breath held too long, wind threading through the trees outside the Hale residence, unsettling the chimes Meredith had once hung by the kitchen window. They used to sing on quiet evenings. Now they clattered, unmelodic and sharp. Lyra sat on the floor of her room, back pressed against the side of her bed, guitar resting in her lap. Her fingers hovered over the strings but didn't play. She could feel it building in her chest again, that cold, tight pressure that started low and coiled upward like smoke in her throat. A drawer slammed downstairs. Then came her father's voice, muffled but unmistakably taut. "I can't do this again tonight," he said to no one in particular. Or maybe to Meredith, still talking to her in the absence she left behind. There had been a time when David Hale was the kind of father who cooked pancakes into the shapes of animals and danced awkwardly in the kitchen just to make his daughter laugh. That man hadn't come home since Meredith died. Grief had turned him into a stranger who still wore his uniform but forgot how to speak gently. The thunder cracked then. Loud, too loud. Lyra flinched, and her guitar gave a discordant twang as her hand jerked across the strings. She pressed her palms to her ears. Her breath came short and fast. Another crash of thunder closer this time. The windows trembled in their panes. She stood abruptly, stumbling as she clutched the neck of her guitar. Her father was now pacing downstairs, voice rising, frustration and helplessness folding into one. "For God's sake, Lyra, you've got to speak. You can't just shut me out forever." But she couldn't speak. Not tonight. Not since the day they lowered her mother's ashes into the ground and all the color drained from her world like paint running in the rain. She bolted out the door. Rain hadn't started yet, but it would. She could smell it in the air, metallic and raw. The storm was coming, and she didn't want to be there when it broke. Her sneakers slapped against the sidewalk as she ran, clutching her guitar tight to her chest like a lifeline. By the time she reached the kennel facility, her clothes were damp with mist and sweat. The front desk staff tried to stop her, but something in her eyes must have warned them off. Or maybe they'd learned over these weeks that silence could be louder than shouting. She didn't go through the front. She took the long way, around the back, through the tall fence that Mr. Anders hadn't fixed yet. She knew every loose panel, every blind spot. Her fingers trembled as she slid through and made her way to the far corner of the isolated unit, the one with the thick gate and reinforced latches. Echo's kennel. The storm grumbled low in the distance, a rolling sound like something ancient waking beneath the earth. The sky flashed silver white. Lyra's breath came in ragged little bursts as she crouched down in front of the cage. Inside, Echo was already awake. He didn't growl, didn't pace. He simply looked at Hooray steady, calm, as if he'd been waiting. Lyra sat cross-legged before the gate, guitar in her lap. Her hands shook so badly she could hardly place her fingers on the strings, but she tried. She always tried. The first notes came out jagged and unsure. She had meant to play something anyfied. Instead, her fingers slid into the familiar chords of a lullaby. It wasn't one she'd learned formally. Meredith used to hum it without lyrics, back when Lyra was small and afraid of the dark. Her voice would drift through the hallway like a breeze. Sleep, my little shadow. Soft, wordless, a rhythm more felt than heard. The music from Lyra's guitar now was imperfect stumbling, strained. Rain began to fall in earnest, tapping lightly on the tin roof of the side corridor. The storm was almost here, but inside this moment, there was no room for anything else. Echo crept forward, ears twitching once before settling. He didn't bark, he didn't retreat. He simply lay down, head between his paws, eyes never leaving hers. Lyra's fingers ached. Her breathing slowed, then caught, then broke altogether as a sob wrenched through her. She dropped her head against the body of the guitar. The strings hummed in protest, but she didn't stop crying. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, the kind of crying that had been swallowed for too long, coming out in hiccuped breaths and damp cheeks. And Echo. He pressed himself just a little closer to the gate, not quite touching, but near, watching. In the years to come, someone would ask her what changed that night, what made her believe a broken dog could be trusted again. She would never have an answer that made sense. But if she had to choose, she'd say, it was the look in his eyes during the storm, the way he didn't turn away, the way he bore witness to her unraveling without fear or judgment, just quiet presence. A kind of mercy only animals seem to understand. The wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a transformer blew. The lights flickered, then died completely. Darkness pressed in around them. Still, Lyra played. Not perfectly, not steadily, but honestly. And Echo stayed. The sound of the latch echoed too loudly in the narrow corridor, even though it was gently pulled. It clicked once, then again, then silence. Lyra stood still just outside the kennel door, her fingertips brushing the smooth neck of her guitar. Her breath was slow, careful, like she'd practiced it because she had. Every night before sleep, every morning before visiting. She didn't look at the trainers watching her from behind the glass panel, didn't glance at the mounted camera in the corner. She only looked at him. Echo. He was already on his feet, tail stiff, ears forward, muscles taut, like a drawn bow. But his eyes, those amber, haunted eyes weren't, filled with the wild panic they once carried. They watched her. The door swung open no more than a shoulder's width before someone behind her whispered, "That's far enough." She stepped in. The air was different past the threshold. It always was. Still tinged with bleach and rubber mats, but underneath it, something else. Something warmer, as if presence alone could shift the molecules of a space. Lyra didn't try to explain it to the staff anymore. She stepped barefoot onto the cool floor. Her guitar was slung over her back. No sudden moves. That was the rule. Not because anyone told her, because she listened to him. Echo's paws shuffled once. He began to circle, wide at first, tracing the walls, then narrower. Each turn bringing him a little closer, like a planet adjusting its orbit. Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor, letting the strap of the guitar slip from her shoulder. She placed the instrument beside her, but didn't touch it. Not yet. Outside the glass, the staff murmured, but she couldn't hear them. She didn't need to. Their body language said enough, phones raised, notepads ready, posture tense. She whispered nothing. Echo circled once more, his head low, eyes flicking from the corners to the glass, then back to her. Lyra didn't move, didn't blink much either. She knew better than to treat eye contact like a test. And then his pace slowed. He tilted his head. There was a sound then, so small she almost missed it. A soft chuff. Not quite a bark, not quite a growl. Just a breath, pushed through the nose. Curious. She reached toward the guitar, slowly. Echo stopped. Her fingers rested on the neck, stilling its slight sway. The wood was warm against her skin. She didn't strum, just touched. Echo's ears flicked. And then he did something no one expected. He turned. With a slow, cautious shift, Echo walked toward the center of the room and lay down. Not all the way, not at first, just on his forepaws. Hindquarters still braced. A coiled spring. Still ready. Still measuring. But it was enough. Then he rolled. Onto his side. Chest exposed. Eyes still on her. Then, finally, onto his back. A long breath escaped Lyra's lips, unbidden. Her fingers trembled. He'd shown her his trust. She didn't cry. Not yet. Not in that moment. Instead, she reached behind her and gently brought the guitar forward. The first notes of Scarborough Fair drifted into the air, light as dandelion seed. Her fingers knew the strings by feel, by memory. This wasn't performance. It was conversation. Her voice, trapped inside her chest for months, spoke now through chords. Echo's eyes blinked slowly. His tail gave the faintest twitch. Outside the kennel, someone muttered, "He's regulating." The director crossed his arms, watching through the glass. "We'll see." Inside, Lyra played softer, almost as if the notes could fall and break if she pressed too hard. When she shifted into a variation note her mother used to hum while washing dishes, Echo's ears perked. The movement startled her, but she didn't stop. Echo rose to his belly, paws tucked under. He didn't move closer, just listened. It was enough. When the song ended, she didn't lift her head. She sat still, waiting, letting the quiet speak. The storm inside him didn't come. She could feel it, like how still water holds a memory of the wind. Echo yawned. Not a warning yawn, a tired one. He was tired. Of fear. Of silence. So was she. Lyra stood, inch by inch, and placed the guitar aside. She walked not toward him, but toward the wall, tracing the path he'd taken before. Then she slid down, sitting with her back against the cool concrete. She didn't expect him to follow, but after a minute, there was the sound of nails on tile, the shuffle of padded feet. Echo walked halfway, then sat. Two bodies in a room filled with old ghosts. But for now, they were only watching each other. And in that quiet, something mended not loudly, not all at once, like the first thread sewn into torn cloth. Unremarkable to the world, but to those who've worn the tarot, means everything. The leash trembled between her fingers, even though her hands had long since stopped shaking. Lyra stood outside the kennel door, guitar slung behind her like armor. She didn't speak hadn't in months, but the staff no longer asked. The silence had become her language, and the dog who had once bared his teeth at the world was now the only one who seemed to understand. Today would be different. Today, she would try to walk him. The director lingered nearby with arms crossed, watching with the tired skepticism of someone who had seen too many hopeful starts end in heartbreak. Behind the glass observation pane, two behaviorists monitored with quiet tension. One held a clipboard, the other held her breath. The lock clicked, and the gate eased open. Echo stood, ears high and still, head tilted just slightly alert but not tense. For a moment, the only sound in the space was the soft creak of the gate hinge and the low hum of distant rain beyond the shelter's walls. Lyra didn't look him in the eyes. She simply knelt, slowly, with her palm out and head bowed. The leash hung between them. Echo didn't flinch. His nose twitched, once, twice. Then he stepped forward, paused soundless on the mat, and sniffed her palm as if reading a letter no one else could see. She moved gently, not to grab, not to force, but to offer. The clip fastened with a soft click. For a second, nothing moved. Then Echo backed up 3 steps, tension curling up his spine like a spring. His legs were stiff, his eyes flicked to the corners. The leash, this simple tether, seemed to awaken something buried. Lyra saw it. The way his breath shortened, the way his tail lowered. The ghosts. She sat back onto her heels and, with the smallest motion, pulled her guitar to her lap. Her fingers found the strings. A minor chord, first soft. Barely a whisper then, the start of a tune he had heard before, countless times through the bars. It wasn't the full song yet, just fragments. Like scattered memories coming home. Echo stopped pacing. His breathing slowed. The leash, once taut between them, dipped and loosened. She rose slowly to her feet, then turned away. No commands, no pulling, just her presence, her song, and the open hallway beyond the kennel. The leash stretched between them again as she walked. One step, another, and then, behind her, the faint rhythm of paws against the floor. Echo followed. There was no urgency in his stride, no heel or halt, just the quiet decision to move forward with her. Each step he took seemed to echo through the sterile hallways like a drumbeat in a war that was finally ending. From behind the glass, the director's expression faltered. Her arms dropped to her sides. The behaviorists froze, the clipboard forgotten. They had spent months running drills, using clickers, treats, electric triggers meant to recondition a broken soldier into something obedient. None of it worked. But the girl had said nothing. She had never asked him to sit, never demanded he heal. Instead, she hummed a melody no one else understood, and somehow the song was what he chose to follow. Halfway down the corridor, Echo paused. Lyra slowed, turned her head just enough to glance back. He sniffed the air. His ears tilted back at the sound of a cart rattling 2 doors down. Instinct tugged him toward caution. His tail stiffened, and his legs went rigid, poised to retreat. Lyra shifted the guitar again and played. This time, Green Sleeves, a tune full of open spaces and quiet longing. Her fingertips plucked each note with tenderness, as if she were stitching a wound only she could see. Echo's ears twitched. He exhaled and continued walking. They reached the end of the hallway where an old bench sat beneath a foggy window. Lyra sat. Echo paced once in a slow circle before lying at her feet, not touching, but close. The leash lay slack between them, as if it no longer mattered. She looked down at him. He didn't look up, but when she played again, the softest verse of the tune, his body shifted just slightly toward the sound, as if something in him remembered what it was to be led without force, to trust without fear, to follow without command. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the windows, not quite thunder, not quite silence. And inside this pocket of stillness, a girl who didn't speak and a dog who didn't trust found rhythm in each other's presence. It was not a breakthrough the way others had defined it. There were no commands obeyed, no tricks performed, only this: one step, one hum, one soul following another through a hallway of ghosts. The morning came with a hush, the kind that arrived after rain had softened the world overnight. The gravel paths in the facility courtyard were still damp, the scent of wet earth lingering in the air. Lyra sat on the bench outside Echo's kennel, guitar across her knees, not playing, just listening to the silence between breaths. Behind her, the click of boots grew louder. 3 trainers approached, all in regulation jackets, arms folded tight against the breeze. One of them, Marcy, the senior handler, cleared her throat. "We've seen enough to admit this bond is unique," she began. "But Echo still hasn't responded to a single verbal command. He doesn't heal, doesn't sit, doesn't stay." "He stays with me," Lyra said quietly without turning around. Her voice barely rose above the whisper of leaves. "That's enough." "It's not protocol," another trainer added. "You can't deploy a K9 unit on instinct." Lyra finally looked at them. There was no fire in her eyes, only a tired kind of calm, the kind that came from having weathered too many storms and learned which winds to ignore. "What if obedience isn't the point?" she asked. "What if that's why he broke in the first place?" Marcy narrowed her eyes. He was trained under classified protocols, operated on command structures most dogs never encounter. He disobeyed orders in the field. That's why he was retired. No, Lyra said softly. That's why he survived. The air grew still between them. One of the junior trainers looked away, lips pressed in uncertainty. Echo, behind the mesh door, remained lying down, head on paws, ears twitching toward Lyra but body unmoved. I'm not asking you to change your program, Lyra said. I'm just saying maybe he's not broken. Maybe he's just not meant to be controlled. Marcy crossed her arms tighter. So what's the alternative? Lyra rose, brushing dust from her jeans. Let him choose. Let the connection not. The command guide. The work. That's not training. That's trust, the younger trainer murmured. A long silence followed. Marcy exhaled. If we do this, it's off the books. A pilot, 1 month, we record everything. No interference, but the second it backfires, I'll walk away. Lyra nodded. No harm to Echo. They shook hands formal, but not cold. That afternoon, the first file was created under a new classification. Instinct. Lead bonding protocol. Subject E3. Echo. Plus civilian handler L. Thorne. The cameras in the facility were recalibrated. Not to measure commands executed, but to study eye contact, proximity, mirroring behavior, patterns of trust, unspoken cues. And so, the redefining began not with drills, but with presence. Lyra no longer brought a clicker or a treat pouch. She brought silence and breath, movement, not orders. When she entered the kennel, Echo didn't rush to her, nor did she expect him to. She knelt on the ground, guitar beside her, and simply waited. Some days, he'd walk slow circles around her before settling. Other days, he lay beside her, not touching, but near. They moved like dancers who had learned one another's rhythms before steps. One morning, she opened the gate, and Echo followed without prompting. No leash, no come. Just the weight of understanding in a shared glance. In the hallway, a staff member accidentally dropped a tray, the clatter sharp and sudden. Echo froze. Lyra froze too thin, slowly crouched, palm upward. He looked at her, not for permission, but for grounding, and chose stillness. That night, in the observation log, someone typed, subject showed measured self-regulation. Handler gave no verbal input, emotional sync evident. A few days later, Lyra stood in the yard as a handler offered her a tug toy and said, see if he plays. Oh. Lyra didn't toss it. Instead, she set it gently on the ground and stepped back. Echo approached, sniffed it, then nudged it toward her with his nose. She laughed to sound surprised, even her. He didn't wag, but his ears lifted. For him, that was joy. In the cafeteria, whispers began. She's not training him, she's listening. Can we even call this obedience? Number. But it's something else. Something stronger. One trainer scrawled in her notes, obedience bends the will. This connection heals it. Back in the kennel, Lyra gently rested her hand on Echo's side as he lay curled beside her. His breathing was slow, eyes half-lidded. Maybe you don't need to follow, she whispered. Maybe you just need someone who doesn't expect you to. Echo didn't move, but his tail just once tapped the ground, like a heartbeat. The photo wasn't meant for the news. It was grainy, taken from a distance, Lyra kneeling beside Echo in the training yard. Her hand hovering just above his head like the weight of touch might startle him back into old wounds. But someone had captured it. And by morning, it was everywhere. The girl who tamed the ghost dog. Like mother, like daughter. Legacy in motion. Lyra Elwood and Project Havenfall. Lyra sat on the edge of her bed, the tablet trembling in her lap as the headlines blurred through tired eyes. Outside her window, the sky held that heavy gray before rain. Air swollen with electricity, but refusing to break. In the quiet, Echo's soft breathing from his cot filled the silence, steady as a metronome that refused to follow any song but hers. She hadn't seen it coming how fast the world would attach meaning to something she hadn't even fully named for herself. They wanted a story. They always did. The press, the scientists, the program sponsors clinging to whatever was left of Project Havenfall's battered reputation. Now, they had one. The daughter of the woman who once trained the most advanced K-9 units was somehow forming a bond with the most damaged asset they'd ever encountered. They didn't see the late nights. The music played through cracked fingernails. The shaking breath she held every time Echo tensed, or worse, when he looked at her like he remembered a life that had broken him. They didn't see that she hadn't tamed him at all. She simply stopped asking him to obey. By noon, the facility buzzed like a stirred hive. Staff whispered in hallways. One of the interns nearly dropped his clipboard when Lyra passed. She heard snippets. She really is her mother's daughter. They should give her her own unit. Think it's just luck? Or blood? Doctor. Hargrove cornered her near the kennels. You've handled this with remarkable grace, he said, tone carefully curated for public optics. Just remember to pace yourself. The media attention may get intense. Lyra didn't answer. She simply nodded, retreating toward Echo's enclosure, where the real conversation would not require words. Inside the training yard, Echo waited. Not sitting, not pacing. Just waiting. Like he knew something in her had frayed that morning. She crouched beside him, fingers brushing the dirt. They think I'm her, she whispered. And I don't even know if I am. Echo tilted his head, ears twitching. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. A gust of wind rolled across the field, carrying the distant smell of ozone and the sharpness of early rain. Lyra let the silence settle between them, her throat tightening around unshed words. My mother could train dogs that wouldn't even look at another handler, she said. She used clickers, signals, commands in 4 languages. I never understood any of that. Echo shifted closer, the coarse fur along his shoulder brushing her knee. I didn't plan for this, she confessed. You weren't some project to fix. You were just the only thing that didn't make me feel like I was breaking. Her voice cracked at the end. And then the rain began it hard. Just a slow, steady drizzle that seeped into her sweater and made everything feel heavier. She didn't cry, but she folded forward, arms wrapped tight around herself, and let her forehead rest against Echo's broad back. He didn't move. That evening, she returned home to find the living room strewn with open mail and the glow of the television muting the room in flickering shades of blue. Her father was asleep on the couch, or at least pretending to be. The remote slipped from his hand. The news anchor was mid-sentence. Bleh. And while Lyra Elwood remains unavailable for comment, sources within the Havenfall Rehabilitation Facility confirmed that this marks the first documented instance of a non-command-based K-9 bonding process showing measurable results. She muted it, set down the tablet, and stood very still. On the wall behind the couch hung the only framed photo of her mother still on display taken during the NATO K-9 conference in Berlin. Her mother stood in uniform, one hand resting on the head of a towering German shepherd, eyes sharp with certainty. Lyra stared at it. That woman felt like mythology, a story too big to live inside the skin Lyra was still trying to grow into. Her father stirred. They're not wrong, he mumbled, eyes still closed. About what? You. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. You're more like her than you know. She looked away. I'm not her. I didn't say you were, he said. But you're not her either. That didn't help. Not tonight. She turned, opened the front door, and stepped into the rain without a jacket. It soaked through her clothes in seconds. But she didn't stop walking until she reached the edge of the field behind the house, the place where her mother used to train at dawn before deployments. Echo followed without a leash. He always did now. She dropped to the wet grass, guitar in hand, fingers trembling not from cold, but from the weight of eyes she couldn't see, judgments she hadn't asked for, and a name she hadn't agreed to inherit. Let's make our own story, she whispered to Echo. No headlines, no legacies, just music and silence. And whatever it was that passed between a girl and a dog too broken to obey but not too far gone to choose her, again and again, without ever needing to be told. Rain pressed like cold fingertips against the wide glass walls of the facility, drawing trembling lines down the surface. Inside Echo's enclosure, something had shifted, something primal and sharp-edged. His pacing was no longer measured. It was erratic, clipped, angry. His growls didn't simmer below the surface. They rumbled out, low and menacing, coiling through the room like warning sirens no one could ignore. 2 days. That's all it had been. 2 days without her. "Doctor." Mara stood stiffly behind the viewing panel, arms folded tight. "He lunged at a technician this morning," she said quietly. "Would have broken skin if the gate wasn't locked." The handler beside her shook his head. "He hasn't eaten, won't engage, all progress gone." Inside the kennel, Echo snapped his head toward every sound, hackles raised like a storm waiting for lightning. When a new staffer passed too close, he threw his body against the gate, snarl ripping from his throat like something torn. The clang echoed. Silence followed. No one moved. Echo did not bark. That would have been canine. He growled like memory, like fear unhealed, like betrayal. Lyra arrived in the early evening, wet from the rain, breath uneven as she pushed through the main doors. She didn't stop to dry her hair or even greet the front desk. She moved on, instinct straight to him. Her boots squeaked softly on the linoleum, heart thudding harder with every step. The moment she turned the corner, Echo's head jerked. He froze. Then he let out a whine so faint it was almost imagined, and collapsed, not in surrender but as if everything holding him up had unraveled. She dropped her bag and pressed herself against the cold bars. "I'm here," she whispered, her fingers slipping between the spaces. "I'm so sorry." Echo crept toward her, slow, tail low, hesitant. His muzzle reached her fingers. He sniffed and then buried his head into her palm, trembling like he was the one who'd been left behind in the storm. Lyra's shoulders shook. "I didn't mean to disappear. My dad, he needed me." Behind her, the director's voice was clipped. "He attacked 2 handlers. This isn't sustainable. We may need to separate." "Number." The word cut through the room like glass. Lyra stood, turning to face them, wet hair clinging to her face, clothes soaked to the seams. "Don't take him from me." "You missed 2 sessions, Lyra. He's regressing into dangerous behavior. We cannot allow emotional dependence to become a liability. Isn't that what he's always been punished for?" Her voice cracked. "Feeling too much? Needing too much?" Silence met her words. "I've read the files," she continued, stepping closer to the director. "He was trained to suppress instinct, forced to obey without trust, then discarded when he wouldn't become a machine." "Doctor." Mara said nothing. Her expression remained unreadable. "He's not regressing," Lyra whispered. "He's scared I abandoned him just like they all did before." Echo sat quietly now, ears back, eyes locked on her like she was the last lighthouse in the dark. A low whine escaped him, barely a breath, but it broke something in the room. Even the air seemed to pause. "I'm not going to be like the others," Lyra said, kneeling again, her hand returning to his muzzle. "He just needs time. Not commands. Not corrections. Time." Mara exhaled, tired. "And what if time isn't enough?" Lyra pressed her forehead against the gate. "Then I'll sit here until it is." Later, after the others had left, the technician named Jonah brought her a blanket. He didn't say much, just nodded toward Echo and offered. "He hasn't stopped watching you since you walked in." Lyra pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, curled up on the floor across from the gate. Her guitar rested beside her, untouched, too soaked to play. "I thought I was strong," she admitted softly. "Like my mom. But I missed 2 days, and everything almost unraveled." Jonah leaned against the wall. "Strength isn't not falling. It's coming back after you do," she smiled faintly. That sounds like something she would have said. A pause. Then Jonah asked, "What happened?" Lyra's throat tightened. "My dad had an episode. He smashed her photo. Said I was just chasing ghosts." Her voice faltered, but she didn't cry. "I wanted to scream, but instead I packed my guitar and left." She looked at Echo again. "And even that hurt him." Jonah didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. As night deepened, the facility emptied. Rain tapped on the windows like a lullaby, only the broken could hear. Lyra lay curled near the kennel gate, half asleep, breathing slow. Echo rose quietly, padding forward. He pressed his body along the bars, close enough for warmth to pass through the cold steel. His tail, once still as stone, thumped softly once, then twice before curling around his paws. He did not growl that night. He guarded her from the silence, from the weight of her absence, from himself. And in that shared quiet, something deeper was formed, not just a bond, but a knowing. She had come back. And he had waited. Always. The sun had just begun to lower, casting long, golden streaks across the field beside the facility. It was the kind of light that softened everything it touched, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The kennel yard, usually humming with trainers' voices and dogs barking, had gone quiet for the day. But Lyra remained, seated cross-legged on the grass just beyond Echo's gate, her guitar resting across her knees like an old friend. Her fingers hovered above the strings, hesitant. She hadn't played since the breakdown, since the comparison headlines, since Echo had nearly been taken from her. But today wasn't about proving anything. Not to the staff, not to the press, not even to herself. It was for him. For Echawo now stood behind the gate, his body still as a statue, ears flicking only at the sound of her breath. "I used to hear this when I couldn't sleep," she whispered. Not sure why she was talking aloud. She'd hum it just quietly enough that I had to lean in to catch it. She strummed once, a soft minor chord that lingered like memory. Echo shifted. Not forward, but his tail gave a slow, uncertain sweep. Lyra closed her eyes. The melody wasn't long. It wasn't fancy or showy. Just a simple series of notes, almost like a lullaby. She wasn't sure if it was a real song or just something her mother had made up on the spot all those years ago. All she knew was that when the world felt like too much, when she couldn't speak or sleep or breathe, right this tune found her. And now, she gave it to him. Each note seemed to cut through the static of Echo's mind, through the scars no one could name. At first, he only watched. Then he stepped forward, one paw, then another. Slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild thing more fragile than himself. Lyra didn't stop playing, not when her throat ached, not when tears slipped down her cheeks in silence, not even when he reached her, nose inches from her knee. Then something happened, something so small the cameras might have missed it. So subtle even she almost didn't notice. Echo exhaled. Not a growl, not a snort, just a long, slow breath as if finally letting something go. And then, impossibly, he lowered himself to the grass beside her. His body didn't touch hers, not yet, but he was close enough. She could hear his heartbeat steady, heavy, present. Lyra played the last few notes, holding them in the air like a fragile thread between them. Then came the moment. Echo lifted his head and rested it gently on her shoulder. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't submission. It was trust. A quiet kind, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. Lyra froze. Her fingers hovered over the strings, her breath caught. And for a heartbeat, she wasn't the girl who tamed the untrainable dog. She was just Lyra, the daughter of a woman who once believed love was quieter than commands, who taught through stillness and music, who always said, "Real connection doesn't come from being heard. It comes from being felt." Lyra turned her head just enough to meet Echo's eyes. They weren't wild now, just tired, softened, searching. "I think you remember her too," she whispered. His ear twitched. He didn't move away. The staff watched from a distance behind the observation glass, unsure if they were witnessing training or a miracle. Inside the facility, someone hit record, but no one spoke. No one dared to, because they all knew. This wasn't something that could be replicated. Not with protocols, not with commands, not even with science. This song, this stillness, this moment was theirs. A melody no one else could hum right. A rhythm only their hearts knew. Lyra set the guitar down slowly, careful not to disturb the weight of his head on her shoulder. Her hand reached up and brushed gently through the fur between his ears, and Echo didn't flinch. If anything, he leaned closer, letting out another one of those long, soul-deep exhales that said more than barking ever could. "I'm still scared sometimes," she admitted, voice barely audible, "of not being good enough, of messing this up, of losing you." Echo didn't respond. He didn't have to. His warmth against her was answer enough. A silence settled over them, not empty, but full of breath and memory and something wordless that felt like healing. And in that golden hour light, Lyra knew something had changed. This wasn't just a bond. It was a language. It was a covenant, sealed not by treats or commands or tricks, but by a song. A quiet one. A broken one, but wholly theirs. The shriek of the fire alarm sliced through the facility like a blade through silk, sudden, high-pitched, and all-consuming. Lyra flinched so hard her pencil dropped from her notebook and clattered to the floor. Across the hallway, a technician shouted something muffled behind a glass door. Lights strobed red in a steady rhythm. Protocols snapped into motion. Doors unlocked with loud mechanical clicks. Staff ushered the dogs out of their kennels and into evacuation rows. It was only a drill, but no one treated drills casually. Not here. Not after what happened during last winter's power outage. Lyra stumbled to her feet, heart hammering in her chest as the alarm echoed down the halls. But her instinct wasn't to run toward the exit. It was to find Echo. She sprinted past the observation room, nearly collided with a volunteer holding a clipboard, and finally reached the familiar fenced quadrant at the rear. His kennel door was already open. The handlers were trying to guide him toward the exit with brisk, practiced gestures. But Echo wasn't moving. He was shaking. His ears were pinned back, and his massive frame pressed low to the floor, tail tucked. His eyes darted not with fear, but with memory. Lyra's breath caught. He wasn't here. Not really. He was somewhere else where the sirens weren't drills and the flashing lights weren't theater. Someone reached for him, one of the new interns, wearing the bright yellow fire-retardant jacket issued for emergency simulations. The moment the jacket rustled close, Echo erupted. A guttural, wounded growl tore from his throat as he lunged back from the man. His front paw knocked over a metal dish, the clanging sound further disorienting him. Then, in a blur, Echo bolted. "No!" Lyra screamed, voice hoarse over the alarm's shriek. The intern fell back, hands raised, while the handlers chased after the dog, but Echo was fast, his body a storm of instinct and confusion. He barreled down the hallway, skidding across the linoleum, claws scratching, vision clouded by something only he could see. "Get the restraints!" someone shouted. Lyra ran. She didn't think, didn't ask permission. She just ran, down the hallway, toward the chaos. She spotted him at the far end, cornered by two staff members and a firefighter stepping into the corridor. The firefighter's uniformed thick black canvas, helmet, face shield might as well have been a soldier's in Echo's fractured mind. His growl was low and savage now, his shoulders rippling with distrust. "Back up!" Lyra gasped, reaching them. "He's about to snap his baring teeth," one of the staff warned. "Don't move," she whispered. Not to the humans. To Echo, she took a slow step forward. Then another. He didn't lunge, but his body stayed coiled like a spring, ears locked on the firefighter. Lyra crouched, her knees trembling. She hummed, quietly, the same melody she had played for him 2 nights before. The one only they knew. "I know," she whispered. "It's loud. You're scared. But you're not there, Echo. You're here. With me." One more note. Her voice caught in her throat, but she pushed through it. A flicker of recognition moved across his eyes. His breathing stuttered. Then, like a tide pulling back, his body began to loosen. The growl softened. The snarl faded. And, slowly, deliberately, Echo turned toward her. She held out her hand, palm open, shaking. He took a step, then another, and then, with a weight that collapsed her heart, Echo walked right into her chest, pressing his forehead into her collarbone. The hallway fell silent, except for the distant whine of the alarm, still echoing through the building. One of the staff let out a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Lyra didn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around Echo's trembling body and let her tears fall into his fur. Later that afternoon, the facility convened an emergency staff meeting. Words like liability, aggression, reclassification, and escalation protocol were passed around like cards in a game no one wanted to win. Lyra sat at the edge of the circle, still in the same hoodie she wore during the drill. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, fingers sore from gripping the hem for so long. "I understand the concern," Dr. Bain said, steepling his fingers. "But we need to remain objective. Echo did not bite. He was triggered. There's a difference. Injure." "And next time?" asked one handler. He was inches away from a firefighter's throat. Lyra's voice was quieter than usual, but steady. "He wasn't trying to hurt anyone," she said. "He thought he was back in the field. He didn't run toward the danger. He ran from it." Another pause. "He listened to me," she added, her voice cracking just slightly. "Even through the fear, he came back." There was a long silence. Finally, the behavioral director sighed. "We'll review the footage, but we're flagging him for reevaluation. Until further notice, Echo won't be allowed out of his unit without advanced clearance and a double leash." The sentence fell like a gavel. Lyra swallowed hard, but nodded. As she stood to leave, Dr. Baines called after her. "We're not giving up on him, Lyra." She looked back. "Neither am I," she said. That night, after the lights dimmed and the world settled into its quieter rhythms, Lyra returned to Echo's enclosure. She sat outside the gate, cross-legged, guitar cradled in her lap. He lay on the other side, eyes half closed, still trembling faintly from the day. She didn't speak. She just played. The same melody, a little slower this time, a little softer. By the second chorus, Echo had scooted closer until his snout nudged through the gap beneath the bars. She smiled through her tears. He was still with her. And that, for now, was enough. The paper was thin, too thin to carry the weight of what it held. Lyra stood alone in the hallway outside the administrative wing, her hands trembling as she reread the words for the third time. The letter was brief, clinical in tone, merciless in decision. Echo, formerly known as Ray 3, had been classified as a high-risk unit. His panic during the fire alarm, his growl, the near bite those seconds, had sealed it. He was no longer considered safe for integration. 7 days. That was all that remained before he would be transferred to an off-site government facility for reevaluation. Everyone knew what that meant. Echo would be tested under stress conditions again. But this time, without Lyra, without song, without a hand that didn't command, but simply reached. Likely outcome, euthanasia. She walked the path back to Echo's enclosure, like someone returning to a battlefield after the dust had settled. The gate was open. Not unlocked open. Someone had left it that way. A quiet goodbye, maybe. Echo was curled in the far corner, not asleep, just still. His ears flicked once when he heard her, but he didn't rise. She knelt beside him, heart in her throat. "They're going to take you," she whispered, placing the letter down between them. "In a week." The German shepherd didn't respond, but something in his body shifted. Not a movement, just the tiniest weight of knowing pressing into his limbs. Her throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have been faster. I should have explained that uniforms don't always mean harm, that loud sounds don't mean danger anymore." Echo lifted his eyes. He didn't understand the words, not all of them, but he understood the tone, understood sorrow, regret, fear. He nudged the paper, his nose brushing its edge before resting gently on her knee. It broke her. She bent forward, burying her face in the thick fur at his neck. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just let her stay there, wrapped in the silence they had come to share. Later that night, Lyra found herself pacing outside her father's office, heart pounding so hard she thought it might split her ribs. She hadn't stood in this hallway in years. Not since her mother's funeral. Not since the house had fallen into measured silence, and everything between them had become about what wasn't said. She knocked once. "Come in, N.V." His voice, always calm, didn't waver when he saw her. David Mercer was not a cruel man, but he had grown thick-skinned to survive grief, politics, war, and everything between. His spine stayed straight even now. Behind that desk, under the glow of a desk lamp that cast half his face in shadow. Lyra didn't sit. "I need you to stop the transfer," she said, trying to keep the desperation from showing. He set down the report he was reading and leaned back. "Lyra, they're going to kill him." No, he corrected gently. "They're going to evaluate him. Objectively, you know what that means." Her voice rose, trembling. "You of all people know." He studied her. His gaze didn't harden, it softened. And somehow, that was worse. "I read the incident report," he said. He panicked, and in that panic he almost bit a first responder. "He's not safe. He is with me. But he won't always be with you. He could be." The words spilled out before she could stop them. "There are other roles. Therapy animals. Private service. You have connections. You could petition." David sighed, folding his hands. "I can't make exceptions based on emotional attachment." Her jaw clenched. "That's not what Mom believed." The air in the room shifted, heavy, quiet. Then his voice dropped low. "Your mother is not here anymore." Silence stretched. "She would have fought for him," Lyra said finally, her voice cracking. "She would have seen that Echo doesn't need fixing. He needs understanding." "And what happens?" David asked. "When the world gives him a situation he doesn't understand?" She didn't answer. Couldn't. Because beneath all her defiance, she had imagined it too. Echo cornered. Echo without her. Echo choosing between flight and bite. "I'm not asking you to cover it up," she said quietly. "Just give me time." More than a week. David looked away. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, if he hurts someone, he won't. "Your name will be tied to that mistake forever." Lyra nodded. "I'll take that risk." He looked up. In his eyes, the echo of someone who had once believed deeply in second chances. Someone who had once followed a woman who taught wolves how to trust again. "You get 3 weeks," he said, "no more." Her knees almost gave out, but she held herself steady. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Prove me wrong." That night, she sat in Echo's enclosure long after the staff had left. There was no music, no clipboard, no protocol, just her voice in the dark. "They gave us 3 weeks," she said softly, her fingers tracing the thick fur along his shoulder. "We have to prove them wrong." Echo lay beside her, head resting against her thigh. Still not asleep. Just there. Lyra reached into her bag and pulled out the wooden whistle. She hadn't played it since that night, after the regression, the night Echo had returned to her quietly, like a soul that had never truly left. She pressed it to her lips and began to play not the full melody, just the first few notes. That was enough. Echo stirred, his ears twitching, eyes soft. They didn't need to speak. In that moment, under the flickering light, Lyra knew something unshakable. Echo wouldn't fail her, and she wouldn't fail him. The sky outside the rehab center was the color of paper left too long in the sun-faded brittle, waiting for something to be written on it. Inside the dormitory room, Lyra sat on the floor, legs crossed, surrounded by a half-opened box that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. It had belonged to her mother. She hadn't opened it in years. There were scraps of sheet music, coffee-stained journals, a faded lanyard from an animal behavior conference in 2006. But her hands stilled when they found a small, plastic voice recorder. One of those old handheld ones with the clunky red button. The kind her mother used to dictate thoughts between sessions, often muttering to herself in hallways, in the car, even in the quietest moments just before sleep. She pressed play, a soft crackle. Then her mother's voice. "If you're listening to this, I hope you're not doing it for answers. Because dogs don't speak in answers. They speak in presence, in pauses, in the space between fear and trust." Lyra's breath hitched. "Every time someone asks me how I train the untrainable, I want to say maybe the question's wrong. Maybe they were never meant to be trained, just understood." There was a quiet laugh in the recording. That gentle, wry laugh that used to echo through their old farmhouse. "Never treat a dog like a task. Treat them like a soul you listen to with your whole being." Lyra closed her eyes. The recorder was warm in her palm, though it hadn't been playing long. She held it close to her chest, as if it could slow the pounding of her heart. Echo was out of chances. 7 days. That's what the board had decided. 7 days until he would be transferred. Reevaluated words that circled the truth, like vultures. Everyone knew what it meant. There weren't second starts for dogs labeled dangerous. Not ones with records. Not ones with teeth. Lyra had begged her, father pleaded. Really. But his voice had been hollow, distant, as if the man who once knelt beside her to teach a puppy how to sit had been replaced by someone colder, more efficient. "He's not safe, Lyra. I wish that weren't true, but you saw it too." Number she had seen fear, trauma. Echo wasn't unsafe. He was unheard. Like her mother had always said, there's a difference. She stood abruptly, grabbing her coat. The old recorder was still clutched in her hand. In the training field, Echo lay curled in the far corner of his enclosure, his body pressed tightly to the wall. He didn't look up when she approached, not even when she whispered his name. But when she knelt and hummed, just the first 3 notes of that melody his ear twitched. She kept humming. Slowly, Echo uncurled. His pause, tentative, his eyes wary, like a soldier waking from a bad dream. He didn't come forward, not fully, but he didn't turn away either. Lyra slipped her fingers through the chain link. "I'm going to show them," she whispered. "We've got 7 days. I don't know how, but we're going to prove them wrong." Echo tilted his head. She took that as a yes. That night, she stayed up past lights out, sprawled across her narrow bed with a notebook open and music sheets spread like wings around her. She listened to every recording her mother had left. Not all of them were clear. Some were just background sounds, wind chimes, a dog barking in the distance, her mother humming as she brushed a shepherd's coat. But they were pieces of something bigger. Not instructions, not commands, a philosophy. At 3 a.m., Lyra wrote 3 words across a blank page. Listen, trust, lead. She underlined them, then circled trust. By morning, she had a plan. In the main office, she stood in front of the board with her shoulders squared and a fire in her chest that hadn't been there in weeks. "I'd like to request a supervised field test," she said. "I want to show you that Echo can save someone, that he's not broken, he's just waiting to be heard." One of the directors, Dr. Collins, a man with a deep crease between his eyebrows and a file always in hand, raised a skeptical brow. "And how do you plan to do that without commands? Without standard obedience?" Lyra took a breath, then placed the recorder on the table. She pressed play. Her mother's voice filled the room again, this time steadier. "Some dogs follow rules, some follow instinct. The rare ones follow people. Not out of fear, not because they're told to, but because something inside them says, this one is worth following." Lyra looked up. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. "I'm not asking you to trust Echo," she said softly. "I'm asking you to trust the bond. If he fails, I'll walk away, but give us the chance to try." A long silence. Then Collins leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Fine, you get one chance." That afternoon, Lyra stood beside Echo on the far field. There were no leashes, no commands, just a heartbeat, and a song only they knew. Snow came sideways thick, wind-driven needles that erased the world a handful of inches at a time. By dusk, the back roads outside Brook Hollow had vanished beneath a white sheet, and the radio in Lyra's room crackled with warnings every 15 minutes. Blizzard advisory in effect until 6 a.m. visibility near zero. Stay indoors. All non-essential travel is discouraged. She might have obeyed if the next bulletin hadn't ripped through her chest like ice. Missing child 6-year-old Milo Kessler, nonverbal autistic, last seen near Cedar Ridge Trail at approximately 3:40 p.m. Search teams hampered by weather parents, requesting assistance from anyone with tracking experience. Lyra's hand froze on the notebook where she'd been sketching training ideas. Echo, curled at her feet beneath the desk, lifted his head, sensing the tension before she'd even processed it. His ears tipped forward, that silent question blooming in his amber eyes. A child, nonverbal, lost in a storm. 7 days left on Echo's countdown. 16 hours until the next review board meeting. But none of it mattered against the image of a little boy alone in the woods, fighting the cold with no language to call for help. Lyra's heart beat once. Hard. Decision made. She slid from the chair and knelt. "We know how it feels, don't we?" she whispered, fingers brushing the scarred fur along Echo's neck. "Alone. Unheard." Echo's tail swept the floor-roan measured stroke, as if to say yes. Outside her dorm window, emergency lights flared across the parking lot as another truck of volunteers rolled out tires spinning uselessly on ice before catching enough traction to grind forward. She had no official clearance, no leash authorization. Worst, Echo had been declared off-site transfer status. If anyone saw her with him outside the gate, it could terminate his last sliver of chance. But the storm didn't care about paperwork, and neither did Milo's frightened parents. Lyra grabbed her parka, shoved the recorder with her mother's voice into her pocket, and clipped the unsafe dog to a worn leather lead. Echo stood calmly, head low, following because she moved, not because she commanded. They slipped through the side exit near the boiler room, a back door the security cameras rarely caught because of steam vents fogging the lens. Wind punched into them instantly, snow crystals whipping across Echo's muzzle. He didn't flinch. He pressed closer to Lyra's leg, fur already frosting white. Listen, trust, lead. The woods loomed dark beyond the service road, tree branches bowing under ice. Search and rescue strobes flashed deeper in, maybe half a mile away. But Lyra veered left instead toward the ridge where Milo's footprints had reportedly vanished. Echo followed the tension on the lead, nose lifted to the wind, drawing in the storm as though scent were music only he could hear. Halfway up the slope, Lyra paused to pull her scarf higher, snow packed into her boots. Every exhale hung like a ghost between them. She unclipped Echo's leash. "Find." She breathed not a command, not the old military bark. Just a request carried on shaky air. Echo bolted forward 3 strides, then stopped, looking back to make sure she was coming too. When she nodded, he lowered his head to the drift, sniffing, weaving, doubling back. The blizzard swallowed sound, but Lyra could still hear the faint huff of his breath as he searched. No clicker, no shouted cues, only instinct, only the bond. Minutesser hours. Time dissolved in white past before Echo stiffened near a cluster of pines. He turned into the wind, tail horizontal, body vibrating with purpose. Lyra stumbled after him, grabbing branches, heart hammering louder than the gale. At the base of the largest tree, half buried beneath a crust of snow, lay a flash of bright red, a tiny knit cap. Echo circled it once, nose brushing the cloth, then barked a single deep note that cracked through the storm. "That's him," Lyra choked, scooping the cap with frozen fingers. Echo was already pressing forward, clawing through a drift that rose up like a white wall. Beyond it, a narrow gully dipped away from the trail steep and shadowed. Lyra slid down on her knees, palms scraping ice. In the hollow at the bottom, curled against a fallen log, was a little boy in a blue coat. His mittens were gone, his lips the color of sky before sunrise. He rocked gently, humming to himself. Soft, repetitive, a sound too fragile to be heard over the wind. "Milo," Lyra whispered, though she doubted he could hear. She clicked the recorder on her mother's voice, whispering calm, rhythmic phrases about trust, about souls, about listening. She placed it near the boy's ear, then began humming the melody. Echo knew the lullaby that wasn't quite a song. Echo lay down beside Milo, not touching, just sharing heat. The boy's rocking slowed. His eyes wide, unfocused, shifted toward the dog's muzzle. Echo whined softly and inched closer, until Milo's shaking fingers found rough fur. They closed there, clinging. Lyra's tears burned hot, even in the freezing air. She pulled out her phone with numb hands, dialed 911, gave coordinates as best she could. "We have him. Cedar Ridge, gully, maybe 30 yards off the South Fork. Sirens in the distance. Too far, too slow." She stripped off her parka, wrapped it around Milo, pressed his hands between hers, kept humming. Echo curled his body to shield them from the wind. Minutes later, though, it felt like the length of a lifetime flashlight sliced through the snow. Voices calling. A rescuer stumbled down the slope with a thermal blanket. Another radioed that they'd found the boy. Lyra said nothing as they lifted Milo, still clutching Echo's fur, into the blanket. Echo followed until the paramedic gently guided him back. The boy released his grip only when his fingers were pried free. After they started up the hill, Milo looked over the rescuer's shoulder. He didn't speak, but his gaze found Echo held Itan for one small moment. The storm felt a little less furious. Lyra pressed her forehead to Echo's and exhaled a shaky breath. "You saved him," she whispered. Echo licked the salt from her frozen cheek. A single wag of his tail slow, deliberate cut through the snow like a promise. They turned toward the blinking ambulance lights, ready to prove to every doubter that souls, not tasks, were worth saving. The wind tore through the trees like a warning. Snow whipped across Lyra's cheeks, biting, relentless. Her boots sank into the deepening white with each step, the rhythm jagged, fueled more by desperation than direction. Ahead of her, a dark shape moved like a shadow given purpose-low to the ground, nostrils flaring, tail rigid with tension. Echo. No harness, no handler, no command, and Yeth led. They had been moving for nearly an hour, slipping through the woods just beyond the edge of town, where Milo had last been seen. The boy's scent had been left behind on a blue woolen scarf. its fibers still faint with warmth when Lyra pressed it into Echo's nose back at the sanctuary's rear gate. He hadn't hesitated. No signs of confusion or aggression. Just a quiet tension, like an old wound waking. She'd seen it, then his pupils sharpen. The same way they had in the video footage, years ago, when he worked beside her mother. That stillness, that silent click into a different kind of awareness. Now, his paws broke the untouched snow ahead of her in steady lines, veering off the beaten trails, into tangled branches and half-frozen creeks. The blizzard had swallowed the world whole. Every few steps, Lyra glanced up to make sure she still saw him. His coat was nearly the same color as the gray dusk, the snowfall thickening now to the point that the trees began to blur together. But Echo's path never wavered. He knew. She didn't understand how only that it was real. Each time she faltered, he paused and looked back. Not like a command, not even waiting, just making sure she was still there. At one point, she slipped. Her knee hit a jagged stone hidden under ice. She gasped, and he stopped instantly, retracing his steps with mechanical speed, pressing his forehead into hers. "I'm okay," she whispered, trying to believe it. His breath steamed against her neck, and then he moved again. It wasn't training. It wasn't obedience. It was something older, something that didn't need words. Lyra stumbled forward after him, teeth chattering now, fingertips aching from gripping branches and slipping over stones. Her ears were numb, her voice long since given to the wind, but she wouldn't stop. The boy's name repeated in her mind with each step. Milo, Milo, Milo. The world had narrowed. Sound became muffled, the howl of the wind, now an oceanic roar. She thought of the search teams that had turned back, citing safety protocols. She thought of the rescue drones grounded by the storm, of the brief, shaking voice of Milo's mother on the news broadcast. He doesn't respond to yelling. He runs from lights. He hides when he's scared. But Echo hadn't needed lights or yelling. He just needed silence. A memory surfaced, uninvited. Her mother, kneeling beside Echo during a training session years ago. Not giving orders, just humming. A melody soft as breath. Echo responding not to words, but to tone, to connection. Now, Lyra could hear that tune again inside her, though the cold was making her lips too stiff to hum it aloud. They crossed into a deeper part of the woods. The snow was nearly up to her thighs now. It was getting dangerous. If she stopped moving, she wouldn't start again. Her breath was shallow, the pain in her legs screaming louder than she wanted to admit. But Echo didn't stop. And then suddenly he did. He froze, ears forward, muscles locked, as if the entire forest had fallen silent with him. He sniffed the air twice, then broke sharply to the left, crashing through a thicket of dead pines with a snarl of urgency. "Echo," Lyra cried, forcing herself to follow. She couldn't see much, but she trusted him now more than she trusted the path. He veered downhill, and the terrain changed rockier, slick with moss beneath the snow. Another 100 feet, a small break in the trees, and there barely visible was a hollow formed beneath the thick root system of a toppled tree, a space just large enough for a child to crawl into. Echo dropped to his belly. A soft whine escaped his throat. Not panic, not aggression. Recognition. Lyra's heart stopped. She dropped beside him, pushing past the low branches, her voice trembling. "Milo?" Silence, then movement. Tiny, hesitant. Two wide eyes peered out from the dark. The boy was curled up, shaking violently, lips blue, fingers curled into his coat sleeves. He didn't make a sound, just blinked, frozen in the stillness of his own world. Echo didn't move. He lowered his head, ears soft, and slowly crept forward, laying down just inches from the boy. And then Milo reached out. His hand rested on Echo's fur. No words, no fear, just a child and a dog breathing together in the storm. Lyra felt something rupture in her chest, the kind of relief that makes you dizzy. She scrambled for the emergency blanket she'd packed, her fingers clumsy, lips murmuring prayers she didn't know she remembered. She wrapped Milo gently, checked his breathing. Shaky, but there. When she turned back, Echo was still lying perfectly still, allowing the boy to rest against him like a heat source. His tail didn't wag, He didn't move, but his eyes, they were calm. And Lyra, staring into them, knew this was what he was meant for. Not leashes, not cages, not checklists. This, a moment like a promise kept. Snow muffled everything. Sound, time, even fear. Lyra's legs trembled beneath her, soaked jeans stiff from wind-whipped ice. The forest had turned ghostly pale. Every branch bowed in silence, as if holding its breath. But she didn't stop. Not when her fingers had long gone numb. Not when the flashlight she carried flickered its last. Not even when her name was surely being shouted from somewhere far behind. She could still see Echo's form low to the ground, silent, head weaving nose, locked to the invisible trail left by a missing boy. Milo, she whispered into the white, as though saying the boy's name would bring them closer. A gust of wind cut sharp across her cheek. She pulled her scarf tighter and stumbled forward. They had been tracking for what felt like hours. Her limbs ached. Her throat burned from the cold air. But Echo hadn't slowed. He was different out here, not the growling, wounded creature they said was broken. Out here, Echo was something ancient, fluid, focused, his ears twitching with purpose, his paws sure over the crust of snow. And Lyra, though scared, followed because some part of her believed this was exactly who he was meant to be. Suddenly, Echo stopped. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stood there, tail stiff, chest heaving, ears locked forward. Lyra's breath caught. Did you find something? He inched ahead, nose twitching, then gave a low whine. She stepped beside him. The forest dipped into a small ravine, barely visible through the thick veil of snow. Then she saw it. A small shape crumpled near the edge of a frozen creek, half covered by a branch heavy with ice. Blue jacket, tiny boots, one mitten missing. Milo. Her voice cracked open. She scrambled down the incline, snow crashing around her. Her knees hit the ground beside the boy. He wasn't moving. His lips had turned the color of bruises, and his eyes were shut tight. For a second, her mind refused to believe what she was seeing. It was too still. Echo! She cried, her hands already reaching to brush snow from Milo's face. Do something! Echo was already there. He approached gently, lowering his head. He sniffed once, then twice. Then, without hesitation, he began licking Milo's cheek slow, rhythmic like a mother waking her young. Lyra fought the sting in her eyes as she reached into her coat pocket. The small wooden recorder felt warm against her frozen fingers. She hadn't played it since the night of the regression, since the night they almost took him away. Now, kneeling in the snow beside a boy neither of them knew, Lyra raised the recorder to her lips and began to play. 3 notes, simple, gentle. The lullaby her mother had written years ago. The one Echo had once leaned into like a memory. The sound slipped into the trees like a whisper, like something remembered by the wind. Echo paused his licking and tilted his head. Then, as if understanding, he let out a low, steady bark just once. Then again, Milo twitched. Lyra gasped. She dropped the recorder into the snow and cupped the boy's face. Milo? Milo, can you hear me? The child's eyes fluttered, then closed again. His lips trembled, but he was breathing. He's alive, she whispered. Echo let out a long, mournful howl. It rose into the white sky, curling through the trees like a flare made of sound. Lyra looked up. The wind was shifting, then faint, but Riala thumping overhead. A helicopter. Keep going, boy, she whispered. Echo howled again, louder this time, desperate and clear. His voice rose through snow and static and fear, and in that moment, it didn't matter that he'd failed tests or snapped at trainers. He had found what no one else could. Another thump closer. A spotlight carved through the sky. Lyra waved her arms wildly, slipping in the snow. We're here! Over here! The light swept once, twice, then stopped. Then, the forest lit up in an artificial day. Echo barked once more and circled Milo, refusing to leave his side. Lyra collapsed to her knees again. Tears, freezing, to her lashes. From above came the voice over a loudspeaker. We see you. Hold your position. Lyra let out a sob she hadn't meant to make. For the first time in days, the knot in her chest loosened. She looked at Echo, who now lay curled protectively around Milo, his breath warming the boy's face. "You did it," she said softly. "You saved him." Echo's eyes met hers. Not the haunted stare from weeks ago, not the cold glare of a broken animal, but something else. Something warmer, softer, like trust, or maybe forgiveness. She reached out, brushing her hand gently along his head. "They were wrong about you." Above, the helicopter began its descent. The rotors scattered the snow into a storm of silver light. But Lyra didn't flinch. She stayed beside Echo and the child, hands steady now, breath calm, the melody still echoing in her heart. Whatever came next, punishment, consequences, questions, it could wait. Because out here, beneath the trees and the snow and the howl of a once condemned dog, a boy had lived, and that was enough. Echo, the German shepherd at the center of it all, stood beside 17-year-old Lyra Hart on a hastily built platform in the park amphitheater. Folding chairs and crayon posters fluttered around them. "Thank you, Echo. You found Milo." Hero pause. Milo, 10-year-old boy with autism who'd vanished in last week's blizzard, sat between his parents, clutching a stuffed fox. Echo's scratched metal tag hung from the boy's neck like a medal no committee could improve. Mayor Beach cleared his throat. "Some heroes wear badges, others wear fur," he said, voice softer than usual. "The miracle here is what happened between a girl who refused to give up and a dog who was never broken, only misunderstood." Scattered applause followed, gentle enough to feel sacred. Reporters kept their cameras low. Sensationalism had no place inside this hush. Lyra spoke next, sweater sleeves pushed to her palms. "I was terrified," she admitted. Echo waited for someone to see his worth. "My mom once told me, never treat a dog like a task. Treat them like a soul." Echo remembered that better than I did. A breeze carried the distant hum of a Melody Mom song, the wordless lullaby Lyra had written on her cello the winter her mother died. One by one, the crowd joined in, humming through wrong notes without shame. Lyra knelt, pressed her forehead to Echo's, and whispered, "It isn't about proving anyone wrong anymore, is it?" Echo exhaled, breath silver in the cold. Commander Elias Hart, Lyra's father and longtime head of the regional K-9 unit, watched the ceremony replay on mute from his empty den. A coffee cup cooled beside a picture of his late wife, Jenna, kneeling with young Lyra and a golden retriever named Scout. Dr. Rosalind, the unit's behaviorist, appeared in the doorway holding a flash drive. "She asked me to give this to you." Elias plugged it in. A single file opened. "For Elias, if I'm gone." Jenna's recorded image filled the screen, sunset glowing behind her. "If you're watching this, I didn't get the years I wanted," she said. "You follow rules, love, but rules can become walls. Lyra doesn't command dogs, she listens. That's not weakness, it's grace. When I'm gone, don't shut her out." The video ended, leaving the room heavier. Elias's hand shook. The coffee spilled and spread like a shadow over the table. Lyra returned after the ceremony, cheeks pink from cold, Echo padding at her side. She stopped short. Her father was at the kitchen counter, paging through her mother's worn journal. For the first time in years, his posture held something like humility. "You were on television again," he said. "They called you the girl who changed the system. They exaggerate." "They don't," he swallowed. "She'd be proud of you." Emotion tightened her throat. Echo sat between them, tail swishing softly. Elias's voice cracked. "After she died, I didn't know how to talk to you without breaking. And I was wrong about him." He gestured toward Echo. "I saw liability. You saw a soul." Slowly, he opened his arms. Lyra stepped into them, grief and relief colliding in a silence broken only by Echo's single, approving bark. When they parted, Elias knelt, offering his hand. Echo pressed his muzzle into the palm, sealing a quiet truce. "I'd like to take him on a walk sometime," Elias said. Lyra wiped her cheeks. He'd like that. The next morning, frost glittered over garlands strung in the town square. People drifted in, parents, teachers, firefighters, drawn by something larger than curiosity. Someone placed a bowl of water at the base of a modest stage, beside a single white rose. Mayor Hallstrom addressed the crowd. "We gather not to award obedience, but to honor intuition, compassion, trust." During the storm, while most of us stayed inside, A teenager and a misunderstood dog stepped into danger, and a child is alive because of it. He lifted a small silver badge engraved with a paw print and the word trust. "This is for Echo," he said. "He becomes the first member of our Therapy and Trust K9 program, not a police dog, not a rescue dog, something more." And so, Lyra pinned the badge to a new collar her father had cut from worn leather. "This is yours," she whispered. "Not because you obeyed, but because you felt." Echo's tail thumped once, deliberate. Speakers crackled to life with the same cello melody. Children queued to decorate Echo's vest with stickers' hearts, snowflakes, colored paws. A girl of 4 leaned in and kissed his nose. "He's not scary," she whispered. "No," Lyra answered, voice thick. "He never was." And toward the edge of the gathering, Elias stood, hands of pockets, eyes bright. No words passed between father and daughter. His nod was enough. A reporter asked, "How did you train him to find Milo? Instinct or experience?" Lyra smiled at Echo. "I didn't train him. I listened." 7 nights earlier, Milo had slipped unnoticed through a back door during the blizzard. Drawn by the flicker of Christmas lights in distant woods, panic spread fast. The sheriff mobilized deputies. Search choppers cut circles through whiteout. Hours passed. Temperatures plummeted. Inside the K9 unit's heated pen, Echo paced, sensing something wrong. Officially, he'd failed every standardized test. Too reactive, too independent, not feasible. Elias had filed the paperwork to retire him permanent until Lyra begged for one last chance. On that night, she ignored protocol, clipped a tracking line to Echo's harness, and followed him into the storm. He pulled her across frozen fields, past creek beds, imploding under fresh ice, into Blackhawk Forest. Snow obscured everything but Echo's single-minded urgency. When she stumbled, he doubled back, nudging her up again. 2 miles in, Echo halted, head high, ears triangulating. A faint cry threaded through pines. Lyra's flashlight found the silhouette of a boy wedged beneath a felled spruce. Milo's jacket was torn, his breathing shallow. Echo crawled into the pocket of space beside him, providing warmth while Lyra called coordinates. Rescue teams arrived minutes later, guided by Echo's unmistakable howl, part warning, part relief. On the ride to the hospital, Milo clutched Echo's tag while Lyra stayed by his side, repeating her mother's lullaby under her breath until the sirens faded into distance. Echo hadn't started life as a hero. Bred for law enforcement, he'd been shipped from trainer to trainer, each colder than the last. A single loud correction had sent him into Nero panic. By the 4th facility, his file carried one word: untrainable. In bureaucratic shorthand, that can mean 2 doors: adoption or euthanasia. Lyra intercepted him at Misty Valley Station, the rehabilitation center her mother had founded on the principle of listen first, control later. Jenna died in an ice accident 2 months before Echo arrived. The staff wanted to break his reactivity. Lyra, a shy cellist, chose instead to play music for him each dusk. At first, he trembled at every bowstroke. Week by week, trembling gave way to listening. Listening bloomed into trust. When he finally lay his head in her lap during a soft major chord, Lyra whispered, "That's grace." Commander Hart's grief had calcified into procedure. He kept Lyra safe by keeping her distant, checking her grades, monitoring curfews, but never crossing the moat of shared loss. Her bond with Echo looked, to him, like sentiment interfering with safety. After Jenna's posthumous message, the walls cracked. Elias watched the rescue footage again and again. Echo breaking through snow, Lyra's hand on his harness, the boy lifted into the helicopter basket. It wasn't raw instinct. It was partnership. The night he read Jenna's journal margins filled with notes about soul over skill, he understood what he'd missed. He apologized with arms open, and Lyra accepted without conditions. Echo sealed the covenant by pressing his muzzle into a commander's hand once clenched around rules. Now Echo carries no muzzle, no choke chain. His collar bears the trust badge and ribbons from children who believe heroes can walk on 4 legs. The Therapy and Trust K9 program will pair dogs like him with kids who speak few words and veterans who carry more memories than language. Lyra is drafting the curriculum. 1 part positive reinforcement, 1 part cello sessions in the old stable. Her mother once transformed into a training room. Echo listens to every note, guarding her like a heartbeat. Elias, retired early from the unit, leads outreach teaching officers how to recognize fear masquerading as aggression, how to read a trimmering tale for what it is, a plea. He walks Echo beside the river at dawn, learning the cadence of trust from paw prints in thawing snow. The cafe that once hosted nothing but gossip now serves Echo Lattice Extra foam shaped like a paw print, 50 cents of each sale funding the new K9 program. In classrooms, kids practice the lullaby on recorders. Even the off-key ones feel like gratitude. At night, the church bell rings not just for services, but to mark milestones. Milo's first day back at school, Echo's first official therapy visit, the anniversary of the rescue. The town isn't perfect. Storms will come again. But something changed when a teenager followed a failed dog into the dark. They brought back more than a boy. They brought evidence that hope, like snow under morning sun, can melt into every crack and choose to stay. On the porch where Scout once slept, Lyra tunes her cello. Echo lies at her feet, eyes half closed, ears flicking toward every creak. She plays Mom's song, letting notes float across the yard. A neighbor pauses while walking her terrier, listening. From inside, Elias sets 2 mugs of cocoa on the rail. One for Lyra, one for himself. No words, just music, dog breath, and the slow knitting together of things once broken. Echo lifts his head, gazes toward the open road, then back at the girl who made room in the world for him to belong. His tail taps twice steady. Patient, sure. Plenty of miles lie ahead. But tonight, there is only this. Shared silence, stitched together by song, and a badge on a worn leather collar catching the last light of day. The hallway smelled of crayons and old carpet scents that spoke of use, not neglect. Echo padded beside Lyra, bronze therapy. Trust K9 badge, swinging from his harness. This was their first school session. Miss Da Silva, the special ed director, greeted them. "Some of these kids don't speak," she warned in a whisper. "I've told them you're bringing someone special." In classroom 4, 8 children sat on colored squares. No greetings, only wary glances. Echo walked straight to a little girl, cupping a plastic horse to her lips. He curled into a loaf and waited. Minutes passed before her tiny hand stroked his ear. The room exhaled. One boy, Jacob, hunched in a corner, fists tight. Echo eased next to him and simply breathed. Jacob leaned in, resting his forehead against soft fur. A single word slipped out. "Safe." Miss Da Silva covered her mouth. Lyra blinked away tears. For an hour, Echo offered no tricks, no demandsonly presence. When he finally stood, the children's eyes followed him with something like hope. A week later, Echo visited a trauma center for adolescents. 16-year-old Marcus stood rigid in a hoodie, eyes hard, sleeves hiding scarred wrists. Echo approached, stopped a few feet away, then lay down, inviting, not insisting. Silence stretched 10 minutes until Marcus slid to the floor and buried his face in Echo's neck. He didn't speak, but counselors exchanged glances as if witnessing quiet grace. By month's end, Echo and Lyra had visited 4 schools, 3 shelters, a veterans hospital. Headlines weren't needed. Progress traveled by whisper, the boy who hummed again, the teen who asked if Echo could visit tomorrow. Presence, not press, became their currency. In a drafty community hall, Echo and Lyra faced seasoned K9 handlersmen and women who'd spent careers barking commands. Folding chairs creaked, uniforms rustled. Lyra, small among them, spoke calmly. "I'm not here to replace your methods, only to share what saved a life." She knelt, touched Echo's chest. He trotted the aisle, pausing beside each person, finally resting against a man in desert camo whose white-knuckled fists screamed memory. Echo's warmth softened the grip before he returned to Lyra. "That wasn't obedience," she said. "That was trust reading you, not waiting for a cue." She sketched a curve on the chalkboard. Stimulus, response versus presence. A gruff voice asked, "We stop controlling them? We start listening," she answered. She played a soft cello melody, Mom's song. Echo gravitated back to the man in camo, placing his head in trembling palms. The veteran whispered about Kaiser, a shepherd who'd taken shrapnel for him in Kandahar. No ranks here, only humans relearning how to feel. Lyra distributed slim packets, a USB of calming music, exercises titled "Trust Begins in the Quiet." By session's end, no one clapped. Transformation doesn't need applause. Autumn painted the trees when a plain manila envelope arrived. Department of Innovation in Animal-Assisted Therapies. Seated on her childhood porch, Lyra opened it with Echo's chin on her boot. We are pleased to inform you that your proposal, the Meredith Hale Sanctuary, has been awarded full funding. Lyra laughed sobbed. Echo, we did it. His tail thumped as if he'd always known. Groundbreaking took place on frost-dusted soil near Whispering Penesta Woods, where Echo had once howled rescue. Townsfolk donated land and labor. A retired mason drove 12 hours in a rattling truck, wordlessly laying foundation in honor of his fallen canine handler son. A mother brought her mute daughter. At the sight of Echo, the girl whispered, "Hi." Progress etched itself in such moments. Above the entrance, Lyra hand-painted her mother's mantra. Trust begins in the quiet. Echo sat sentinel while letters dried. The sanctuary resembled a storybook cottage. Skylights over therapy mats, wrap-around porches, gardens for veterans to till. Instruments lined the wall shielding through melody instead of commands. At the center stood a bronze sculpture of Lyra and Echo mid-astride, plaque reading, "For those who listened before commanding, trusted before training, loved without needing words." On opening day, Commander Elias Hart lingered at the back, arms folded to hold something in. He stepped forward with a small box containing Jenna's whistle, the one she'd worn but never blown. "She never needed it," he said. Lyra's fingers closed around the cool metal. "Neither does Echo," she replied. It wasn't a grand speech, but old wounds softened. The first official resident wasn't a child. It was Scout, a graying rescue shepherd who'd stopped eating after outliving his handler. At the gate, Echo greeted him with a gentle chuff, leading the weary veteran indoors. They lay together in a sunbeam, two soldiers sharing unspoken dialect. Lyra watched, heart full. This, she realized, is why the sanctuary exists, not to fix, but to offer time, silence, and something sturdy to lean on. Oh. Weeks passed in small victories. Jacob, once withdrawn, now drew Echo with wings and asked if dogs dream. Marcus volunteered in the garden. Sleeves rolled high, scars shown without shame. The Kandahar veteran returned to assist therapy sessions, Kaiser's memory warming inside rather than wounding. Echo remained the Brigino longer, untrainable, simply irreplaceable. Coffee served Echo lattes, of French funding doghunt programs. Children practiced Lyra's melody on recorders. Even squeaks felt sacred. Evening bells rang to mark first words spoken, anniversaries of rescues, the day Scout chased butterflies again. Elias, semi-retired, led outreach classes on reading stress signal teachings distilled from Echo's quiet example. At dawn, he walked the shepherd along the river, learning trust from paw prints in thawing mud. Snow fell softly on the sanctuary's opening month anniversary. Lyra strummed her guitar beneath porch lights while Echo rested his head on her knee. Through the window, the sign glowed gentle gold. The Meredith Hale Sanctuary. Trust begins in the quiet. Volunteers inside shared cocoa. Scout snored by the hearth. Children's drawings covered a bulletin board titled Victories. Lyra looked down at her partner. "We're just getting started," she whispered. Echo's ears flicked. His tail tapped twice steady, patient, certain. Where war once shaped reflex, peace now shaped purpose. Tomorrow, another frightened child would arrive. Another soldier would step through the door, unsure how to breathe. Another dog labeled failed would find space to simply be. Echo would greet them the same way he always had, without command, without precondition, proving again and again that healing doesn't roar. It listens. The auditorium wasn't grand, just a modest hall tucked behind the public library in a town most maps forgot. But tonight, every seat was filled. The walls, once pale and undecorated, were adorned with photographs, black and white moments captured at just the right blink of time. A boy resting his forehead against a dog's snout. A child in a wheelchair grinning while a German shepherd leaned gently into her lap. Lyra sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hand resting over Echo's. Echo sat beside the podium now, his coat still proud, but laced with flecks of gray. His eyes followed every motion Lyra made, like always calm, alert, grounded. He no longer paced or flinched at sudden sounds. Age had softened the tension in his shoulders. but not dulled his senses. He wore his badge not of rank or war, but of trust, stitched into the therapy vest snug around his chest. Lyra stepped up to the microphone. She wasn't trembling. Not tonight. The soft hum of feedback flickered, then faded. The room fell still. Lyra's hands hovered for a moment over the mic. Then she smiled quietly, not for show, but in that way someone does when they realize they're no longer afraid of being seen. "I used to think silence was a cage," she began, her voice gentle, deliberate, but unwavering. "Now I know it was a path." A few heads tilted. People leaned forward. A man near the front folded his arms, nodding slowly. "I didn't speak for 6 years," she continued, pausing just enough to let it land. "After the accident, my words felt like broken glass. Sharp, scattered, dangerous. People tried to help, but most of them only made the silence louder." She glanced at Echo. His ears perked. "Then I met someone who didn't need me to speak, who didn't expect it, who sat beside me every single day, whether I spoke or not. He didn't ask questions. He just listened with his eyes, with his breath, with his body. That dog, that soul, gave me back something no one else could." And Echo let out a soft huff. A small boy in the front row giggled. Lyra reached into her pocket and pulled out a well-worn dog tag. It wasn't metal-lit, was wood, hand-carved, faded at the edges. She held it up. This was Echo's first tag. Before the badge, before the ceremonies, it says, "Stay, just stay." That's what I wrote, the first day he came home with me. The room stilled again. Everyone always talks about commanding dogs, teaching them to obey. But Echo didn't heal because I gave him orders. He healed because I didn't. We healed together. Quietly, slowly, without force, without fear. She took a breath, steadying her hands on the podium. And eventually, something strange happened. I started to speak. Not because I was pushed, but because I didn't need to anymore. That's the paradox. I found my voice by not needing one. There it was, the ripple of silence, not empty, but full, charged with something invisible but deeply alive. A mother in the third row dabbed at her eye. A teenage boy looked down at the service dog lying at his feet and gave her a scratch behind the ear. Lyra stepped aside, letting the words settle in the room's wood and walls and hearts. The Moderatora woman with silver hair and a purple scar froze slowly and placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned to the crowd. "Let's take a moment to honor the bond that changed not just one life, but many." The audience rose. A standing ovation, not loud or wild, but warm and grounded, like a hearth fire instead of a bonfire. Echo stood too, sensing the shift. He didn't bark. He simply turned, placed his front paws up on the edge of the stage, and looked out at the people like he always had, with steady presence, not show. Afterward, in the quiet behind the curtain, Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor. Echo curled beside her, his chin on her knee. She looked at him. "You did good." His tail thumped once. "Do you remember that first winter?" she asked, tracing the grain of his tag with her thumb. "When we found Milo by the creek?" Echo blinked slowly. "You didn't need words back then either. Just barked your lungs out until someone listened." She laughed softly. "Maybe I should have learned that trick sooner." He leaned his head against her shoulder. It was heavier now, slower, but no less present. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting amber streaks across the sidewalk. Children laughed in the distance, and somewhere maybe in a nearby classroom a piano played a familiar melody. Lyra's melody. The one Echo had heard when he first decided she was worth trusting. They stayed there for a long while. No one rushed them. No one needed to. Because sometimes the most profound moments didn't come with applause or headlines or triumph. They came in the quiet. In the way a dog rests beside a girl who no longer hides. In the way silence, when honored, becomes something sacred. And in the way healing arrives not as thunder, but as snowfall. One breath, one bond, 1 year at a time. The auditorium smelled faintly of crayons and wood polish. Folding chairs creaked beneath parents shifting in their seats. Programs rustled like falling leaves. And on stage, children whispered nervously in line, their polished shoes tapping soft rhythms on the wooden floor. The banner above them read in marker letters, "Spring Harmony, a celebration of voices." Somewhere near the front, Echo rested on a soft quilt. His fur, now peppered with gray, caught the light in a way that made him appear almost regal. He didn't wear a badge tonight, just a blue bandana with stitched words. Still listening. He was older now. The tempo of his tail had slowed. His body stiffened after long naps, and sometimes he would gaze at things no one else could see, as if revisiting places only he remembered. But tonight, his eyes never left Lyra. She stood just off stage, clutching her violin like it was part of her own body, something grafted to her gently over years of trust and trembling notes. Her dress was simple, pale blue, the color her mother used to paint skies on old sketchbooks. On her wrist hung a braided leather cord, the same one Echo used to wear during training. A teacher approached her, whispered something kind and practical, and smiled and stepped back. Lyra took one breath, then another. Her gaze found Echo's, and without thinking, she touched her chest 3 times with her fingers, the signal she used years ago, when words were hard and silence was safe. Echo blinked slowly. The old dog raised his head an inch, then lowered it to his paws again, as if to say, "I'm here. You go on." She walked into the light. The auditorium softened. Children in the front row fell still, sensing the hush wasn't ordinary, it was sacred. Parents leaned forward, their faces lit with expectancy, and something else, something harder to name, reverence. Lyra didn't speak. She only looked at them, looked at the bow in her right hand, then drew it slowly across the strings. The sound was soft at first, like memory, like the first line of a story told in a whisper to someone who's finally ready to hear. The opening notes of her mother's melody filled the room. It wasn't complex, no flourishes or grandeur, just an honest line, like breath, like dawn. The tune had no name, but everyone in the room seemed to know what it meant. Each phrase bent gently toward the next, carrying something inside it: gratitude, ache, recovery. Some of the children in the back, those who'd worked with Echo and Lyra at the sanctuary, began to hum. Not loud, not planned. Just a few small voices threading their way into the music, some with words, some just humming, like wind in the tall grass. One child stood, then another. Soon the stage behind Lyra was quietly filled, not just with classmates, but kids from shelters, speech centers, and foster programs. Each one carried a handmade flower paper, fabric, even felt, and placed it gently on the edge of the stage near Echo. He didn't move, but he watched. One ear twitched when a little girl dropped a yellow bloom with the word hope written on its petal. A boy stepped forward, one who hadn't spoken for years, until Echo pressed his nose into the boy's clenched hand one rainy afternoon. He simply whispered now, almost inaudible, "Thank you," and sat back down. Lyra's melody slowed, then stopped. There was no applause, not right away. First, there was stillness, the kind that isn't quiet because of fear or protocol, but because something deep inside everyone has been stirred, and no one wants to disturb it too soon. And then, like dawn breaking over silence, the room filled with a slow, rising standing ovation. But Lyra didn't bow. She turned toward Echo instead and knelt down beside him. Her hand rested on his side. His breathing had deepened, his body warm against the chill of the auditorium floor. Someone in the audience called out, not in words, but in tears. Someone else began singing the melody softly, their voice breaking on the third note. It wasn't just a school concert anymore. It was a homecoming, a benediction, a promise. One of the teachers snapped a photo at just the right moment. Lyra, in her pale blue dress, resting beside Echo, surrounded by a field of paper flowers. That image would travel far. Later that night, it would be printed in newspapers, featured in a local magazine under the headline, "Final Performance, Eternal Echo." But in that moment, it wasn't for the world. It was just for them. Lyra leaned down and whispered something into Echo's ear. No one heard the words, but everyone saw the tears in her eyes. She wasn't crying out of sadness. She was crying because, for the first time in a long while, her music had been fully heard, not just by an audience, but by the one who first taught her the power of silence. Echo didn't move for a long time, and then, just as the lights dimmed, He lifted his head one more time and rested it gently on her foot. Like always, like home. The room had emptied, but the quiet remained behind like a final guest that refused to leave. Lights dimmed, stage curtains drawn, chairs scattered with program pamphlets folded in half or left sitting open like abandoned stories. A faint echo of laughter still lingered in the walls, but it softened as the air settled. Outside, the evening painted golden shadows across the parking lot. Inside, only two figures remained under the still warmth of the auditorium lights, Lyra and Echo. She sat cross-legged at center stage, her guitar now resting beside her rather than in her lap. The concert had ended nearly an hour ago. No encore, no announcement, just the way she wanted it. Echo lay curled at her feet, one paw outstretched, the other tucked beneath his chin, as if still listening to the last vibration of the strings. His coat, once sleek and fierce in form, now wore time in soft gray patches around the muzzle and eyes. Lyra didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, her fingers absent-mindedly traced the outline of the strings. Not playing, just feeling. Sometimes, silence wasn't a pause. It was the music itself. A janitor paused by the door with a mop in hand, recognized her, then backed away slowly, offering the kind of reverent space usually reserved for church pews or grave sites. Echo shifted gently, his breath warm against her shin. His eyes blinked once, slowly. That kind of blink that said, "I'm still here, and I've seen enough," in the same breath. She looked down at him. There were 1,000 things she could have said in that moment about loyalty, about healing, about how Echo had given her a language no one else could teach. But she knew better now. Words were often just placeholders for presence, and Echo had never needed words. Instead, she leaned forward, resting both palms on the stage floor, close enough to feel his breath. Her forehead touched his, and for a long moment, they simply stayed like that girl and dog, wound and balm, voice and silence. Outside the double doors, wind pushed gently through trees, their leaves rustling like distant applause. Not grand, not orchestrated, but genuine. Lyra sat up slowly, blinking back something soft behind her lashes. Not sadness, not joy, just completion. She reached into her guitar case and pulled out a small, folded scrap of paper worn at the corners, smudged slightly where her thumb always landed. On it was a single sentence she had written the night she met Echo. Some bonds don't need commands, just presence. She unfolded it now and placed it gently on the stage beside Echo's paw. As if he knew, Echo let out a soft exhale. Not tired, just content. His body eased into the floor. His tail gave one lazy thump against the wood just, once and, then stilled. Lyra's fingers moved to his ear, brushing the fur there like she used to when he first came home, broken. Unsure if the world still had a place for him. Back then, he would flinch. Tonight, he leaned into it. And just like that, he closed his eyes. She waited, watched his chest rise and fall. Slow, even. The breath of one who had done his work, who had given all he had, and somehow still left more in his wake. Children had laughed tonight. A boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years had stood up in the crowd and asked, "Can I pet Echo after the show?" And he did, hands trembling, eyes wide, breath held. Echo hadn't moved, hadn't needed to. He had just looked at the boy the way he always looked at Lyra, like he saw something the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. Lyra closed her eyes now, recalling the moment with the kind of stillness that heals more than movement ever could. Around her neck, a small pendant glinted in the soft stage, light the shape of a paw print, embedded with an old police badge fragment, a gift from the department. "He's not just a dog," the captain had said. "He's a damn lighthouse." Lyra stood slowly, pressing her hand once more to Echo's side before gathering her things. She didn't call him, didn't ask him to move. Tonight, if he wanted to stay, she'd let him. But as she reached the stairs at the edge of the stage, she heard the soft creak of paws shifting, nails clicking gently on wood. A moment later, she felt the warm brush of his body beside her leg. Echo had risen. Not fast, not proud, but steady. She looked down at him, and he met her gaze with the same unspoken agreement they had shared since the beginning. "Where you go, I go." She smiled, but not for him, for herself. Because in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't their last note. It was just the last note of this song. There would be others quieter, softer, maybe even without melody. But they'd be written all the same. In every child Echo comforted, in every trainer Lyra taught, in every moment someone chose trust over fear. They stepped off the stage together. No spotlight, no music, just presence. Sometimes, it's not the words we say, but the quiet ways we show up for each other. A gentle nudge, a patient presence, a steady gaze that says, "I'm here." Echo reminded us that love doesn't always need a voice, that the loyalty of a German shepherd, tested by fire and healed by kindness, can be one of life's most profound gifts. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt understood without saying a thing, then you already know the bond is real, and it's sacred. If you're curious about deepening that connection with your own dog, maybe finding a way to better understand their needs, their signals, their heart, there's a resource I came across that's genuinely thoughtful. It's not flashy or loud, just something that might speak to you if you believe trust begins in the quiet. No pressure, of course. Just something to explore when you're ready. Thanks for staying with us through Echo's journey. May it remind you that even in silence, love speaks the loudest.